It's a funny thing, ambition. It can take one to sublime heights or harrowing depths, and sometimes they are one and the same. These words were spoken by the Empress of the Isles, Lady Emily Caldwin, as she pondered the corrupting influence of power and why so many who set out with lofty goals end up falling to darkness and despair. It's a sobering thought that is explored all throughout Arkane Studios' breakout hit, Dishonored. The story of a regent slain by her jealous courtiers, an empire crumbling under the neglect of the rich, and a masked assassin who restored the throne to glory, either through blood or mercy, depending on who you ask. The thing is, I think Caldwin's idea goes beyond the walls of her home in Dunwall and actually has a second, far more prophetic interpretation. The heights, the depths, and the ambition, well, that could easily be a warning to the people who forged this series. The outsiders who are now standing in the bright lights of the mainstream, all eyes trained on their world of steam and whalebone, waiting to see what would come next. Could Arkane Studios deliver a sequel that satisfied everyone? Those fans that loved its open-ended and reactive gameplay, the students of its lore enthralled by magic and mystery, corporate publishers desperate for another financial hit, and even their very own developers, keen to flex their creative muscles. With pressures and ambitions this high, there could only be one outcome: sublime heights and harrowing depths. The thoughts of Emily Caldwin proving as insightful for her creators as for her kingdom. This is the tale of the beautiful chaos that is Dishonored 2 and its strange spin-off sister, Death of the Outsider. A story about what happened to Arkane Studios after their masterpiece was devoured and the people cried out for more. Before we begin, I need to quickly point out that much like the game we're discussing, this video is also a sequel, and it's going to presume that you've watched The Twisted World of Dishonored. That video explored the complex history of Arkane Studios, the careers of its co-owners Harvey Smith and Raphael Colantonio, how they ended up being purchased by Bethesda and began working on Dishonored. The full story is a pretty uplifting tale of creativity finally winning the day, and I heavily recommend that you watch that video before this one. Not only as it will provide proper context for everything we're going to talk about, but because you can't appreciate the tumble down the mountain without seeing what it took to reach the peak. There will also be story and gameplay spoilers for every entry in the Dishonored series, so consider this your last warning. Now, let's return to our world of whales, mechanical soldiers, and magical vengeance. Dishonored released in October of 2012 and had been a big hit, raking in stellar reviews from critics, winning a host of prestigious awards, and had backed it up with over 5 million units sold, a number that was almost unheard of for a game in this style. It eschewed an open world in favour of linear levels. It had virtually no traditional cutscenes. You couldn't see everything it had to offer in a single playthrough, and its gameplay didn't even fit into a specific genre. By every measure, it was exactly the sort of game that the industry was turning away from during the 7th generation. And yet when players stepped out into the sprawling streets of Dunwall, it was obvious you were experiencing something special. So, given all of this, you might think that a sequel would be the obvious next move, but funnily enough, that wasn't exactly what studio co-leads Raphael Colantonio and Harvey Smith had in mind. You see, Dishonored had originally been intended as a stand-alone game, and this meant that as the credits roll, we're left with a pretty definitive ending. This meant that when sales were far higher than expected, and Arkane were given the opportunity to produce a big-budget DLC expansion, the decision was made to set this in a parallel story. So, when work on that DLC finally wrapped up, and sales had only continued to grow, Arkane were left with a difficult choice. Reopen the Dishonored story and carve out a sequel, or cash in on their new massive reputation and produce something new. Well, the ambitious studio decided to do both. While Harvey Smith wanted to press on with another Dishonored, Raphael Colantonio desperately wanted to use this as a chance to produce the game of his dreams. A sci-fi immersive sim set in a large continuous space, heavily influenced by his favourite game, Origin Systems' PC classic, System Shock. With the two owners heading in different directions, the decision was taken to split the Arkane team, and have their Austin-based studio working on Colantonio's project, while everyone in Leon began development on the next Dishonored. Now, despite ending up on different sides of the Atlantic, the relationship between the two creative leads stayed as strong as ever, and in interviews, Smith would constantly say that he felt the game Austin were producing was the best thing he'd ever played. And apparently Colantonio was constantly sent preview builds of Dishonored 2, where his feedback was always taken very seriously. That all being said, the masterminds behind Dishonored 1 had still broken up, and it meant one of the first things that Smith had to do when he arrived in Leon was grow the team and replace people who had shifted over to Austin, along with Sébastien Mitton, Christophe Carrier and Hugh Tardif, who returned as the art director, lead design director and technical director. Promotions were handed out to Dinga Bakaba, who became the lead game designer, Joachim David, who was made the lead level designer, and Damien Pouillon, who was put in charge of animations. While Smith had lost key people in the split, it was still a very experienced team, most of whom had been with Arkane for a very long time and clearly understood what had made Dishonored so special. Now, this was something that weighed heavily on Smith, as for him this wasn't just about making a great sequel, but about healing a wound that he had been carrying for over a decade. Back in the early 2000s, he'd worked at Ion Storm and had been a crucial part of the team that had created Deus Ex, the much beloved grandfather of the modern immersive sim genre. It had been a big hit both critically and commercially, and this had inspired the team to grow in their ambitions, splitting in half and starting 2 concurrent projects, a new instalment in the Thief series and a Deus Ex sequel, which would be led by Smith. Now, while Deus Ex Invisible War released to pretty solid reviews and actually sold better than the original, its reputation soured very quickly, and Smith has always been very candid in interviews about what he thinks went wrong. Essentially, it was a perfect storm of small mistakes. They lost too many experienced team members to the company split. They had issues developing the game on a new engine. They struggled to replicate the gameplay in a way that would work on home consoles, and Smith even went through a divorce while trying to manage his first solo directorship. It's a well-documented moment in video game history, but I want to focus on a specific explanation that Smith gave while doing an interview for the YouTube channel NoClip. To summarise, he felt that a key reason people didn't take to Invisible War was that during the development, the team had become obsessed with not repeating themselves, and this had caused them to create a game that didn't feel like Deus Ex. It had a totally different UI, it didn't really have any of the same characters, and it pushed the setting far into the future, transforming the relatable capitalist dystopia into something that looks more like a cyberpunk space opera. Now, the point of this isn't to dump on Smith's earlier career, but instead understand his mindset going into Dishonored 2, as it's very obvious from the game's marketing that the spectre of Invisible War was looming over how he approached this project. Interestingly, he would constantly make allusions to Raymond Loewy, a legendary French designer who had worked on everything from trains to glassware and kitchen appliances, and whose logos are still being used today by companies like Shell and Coca-Cola. Loewy's central philosophy was called Maya, or most advanced yet acceptable. The idea that design should push boundaries as far as they can go without losing touch with what people like about the original. Smith would bring this up a lot when asked about what Arkane were trying to achieve with Dishonored 2. Yes, they wanted to make something different, but they also wanted to give people more of what they already loved. A decision that was clearly driven by the memory of the last time his company split in two and he tried to make an overambitious sequel. This meant that unlike other high-profile sequels of the era, like Mass Effect 2, which dramatically reworked the series' combat, or Batman Arkham City, which expanded the structure into a sprawling open world, Dishonored 2 would instead focus on refining the original's core ideas. In a lengthy interview with Eurogamer, Smith described how this meant small but meaningful changes. Things like adjusting the chaos system, adding more challenge to the moment-to-moment gameplay, and making everything slightly larger, with more levels, more powers, more locations, and more ways to progress through each level. Now, the risk with this sort of approach is that it doesn't actually sound very exciting. But thankfully, Smith's cautious approach was counterbalanced by the ambition in his team, as they wanted to push things into new and exciting places. The biggest of these was the setting, a shift that saw Dishonored 2 move away from the gloomy gunmetal streets of Dunwall to the sunny shores of Karnaca, a decision that was spearheaded by art director Sébastien Mitton. After a trip to Long Beach in California, he'd been taken with the way the setting sun created dramatic vistas, and when he returned home, he pushed for the team to step out of the darkness of the past and create an environment that felt vibrant and alive. His vision was of a city influenced by Barcelona and Nicosia, a verdant Mediterranean-style metropolis that reflected the southern geography of Dishonored's world. It was a change that some team members were worried about, as Dunwall had been so integral to Dishonored's identity, but Mitton was certain that they could still retain the iconic atmosphere of oppression and decay, whilst also expanding the horizons of the Empire of the Isles. Now, interestingly, Viktor Antonov, who had been such a driving force behind the look of Dishonored 1, did not return to work on the sequel. While this was obviously disappointing, considering his sheer talent for cityscape design, Mitton's team were more than up to the task. The driving philosophy behind the work was graphics are not art. And once again, a huge amount of importance was placed on creating concept art and giving designers high-quality reference material, with the team even going as far as to commission life-size sculptures to help engineers visualize lighting, or producing working replicas of in-game items to aid with animation. The result is one of the most visually cohesive locations in video game history, but actually getting all of this artistic endeavour into the game required some major surgery to Arkane's processes. Dishonored 1 had been put together in the Unreal Engine 3, and while Smith and Colantonio were both very complimentary about the toolset, there were certain things that they wanted to do which required a change in direction. Rather than shifting to the Unreal Engine 4, they heavily modified a version of id Tech Core 5, rewriting almost 70% of the toolset's code and transforming it into a Dishonored-specific engine, the Void Engine. According to Smith, the reasoning was that they wanted to stick with Dishonored's watercolour-influenced graphical style, but add in modern lighting techniques. And along with this, they wanted to create an AI system that would allow NPCs to shift seamlessly between static animations and involvement in the gameplay, both things that the Unreal Engine 4 wasn't really well suited to do. Alongside the underlying tech and the grand new aesthetic, there was another large change that the team wanted to implement, and this related to the cast and characters. Early on, it was decided that Dishonored 2 should be set 15 years after the original, as this would allow them to maintain a connection to the familiar past while exploring what happened after Emily Caldwin ascended the throne. In fact, it was the character of Emily that drove this decision, as Smith felt it would be very interesting for players to see the moral compass from the original grow into a much more active part of the story. This was a young girl who had seen her mother killed, had ascended the throne as a child and been raised by an assassin, a captivating mixture that would make for a perfect main character. Now, that might not seem particularly Maya, but that's because Smith also made it clear in interviews that while we could play as Emily, Corvo would be returning as one of two possible protagonists, giving players a choice between new and old. Now, eventually the time came to let fans and the media in on their hard work, which happened at Bethesda's E3 showcase in 2015, where a distinctly nervous-looking Raphael Colantonio and Harvey Smith took to the stage to reveal Dishonored 2 to the world. The headline grabber was another high-quality cinematic trailer, which once again used a combination of first and third-person camera angles to simulate elements of the gameplay and introduced us to the core concepts of the narrative. We see Karnaca in its full depraved glory, a place where the sun shines overhead, the sea glimmers with crystal clarity, and dissenters are executed in the streets. Over images of a mysterious figure leaping between rooftops and insects laying their eggs in dead bodies, we hear the outsider posing a question. Did you ever really deserve to rule, and what would you do to regain the throne? We're then treated to an eye-watering visual of our masked assassin, Emily Caldwin, entering a grand mansion and watching as it warps and twists with the flick of a switch, placing her face to face with her target and two looming mechanical soldiers. It's pretty exciting stuff, full of possibilities about what the game could involve, and was met with huge amounts of applause both in the conference centre and online, where the response was almost universally positive. Considering they were following on from a much beloved game and had seemed to pitch the sequel exactly where people wanted, the stage was set for another Arkane hit, but this is also where things started to go slightly wrong. Curiously, instead of bringing back the much-loved Tales of Dunwall, excited fans were served up a very hokey-looking live-action trailer, which cast real actors as Corvo and Emily and tried to recreate their supernatural adventures in Karnaca. Thanks to the cheap-looking costumes, low-budget CGI, and content that was far more focused on action than revealing anything about the narrative, It felt more like a fan project than something designed to look cinematic. It might sound cynical, but marketing does play a very important role in how video games are received, and it's perfectly possible to release a totally average game, like Dead Island or Watch Dogs, and enjoy massive sales because of the excitement generated by their trailers. It meant that rather than relying on advertising hype, Arkane would have to earn every single sale through the quality of their work, and it meant that there was quite a lot hanging in the balance when Dishonored 2 finally released on the 11th of November 2016. Would the creativity of Arkane's design be enough to overcome the lukewarm marketing campaign? Would the company split mean that Leon didn't have the right people to deliver more of what fans already loved? Would Harvey Smith be able to shake off the demons of his past and put out a sequel that did the original justice? Well, there's only one way for us to find out, and it requires us to step into the streets of Karnaca and into a world bursting with colour, violence, and conspiracy. Once again, our story opens with the voice of an empress. We hear Lady Emily Caldwin ruminating on the past, as thanks to the approaching anniversary of her mother's assassination, she's haunted by memories of the plague and her time in captivity. What did it cost Corvo Attano, her royal protector and father, to place her on the throne? And has she grown into the ruler that Jessamine dreamt she could be? The reason this weighs so heavily on the young empress is that she is beset by a new kind of crisis, one that cannot be slain by the sword or cured with medicine. A murderer is on the loose in her kingdom, eliminating critics of the Caldwin dynasty in brutal fashion, and making it seem as if the empress and her protector have sunk to new lows in order to retain their grip on power. Newspapers and the citizenry have taken to calling it the Crown Killer, and as political pressure builds with each new death, young Emily is torn between abandoning her position and lashing out with executions, anything to relieve the strain. While the days of unstoppable disease and open rebellion might be long in the past, all is not well within the halls of Dunwall Tower, and as we step into the role of the Empress of the Isles, things only get worse. We find Emily and Corvo holding court in the throne room, attempting to placate the nobles before the anniversary celebrations can begin, and laying flowers in memory of Jessamine. From these interactions, it's clear that the two are very close, and unlike in Dishonored 1, there's no mystery around their relationship, as they openly refer to one another as father and daughter, and speak of the Crown Killer targeting them, rather than just Emily. It's a small part of the opening, but it's the first clue that Emily's rule may not actually be particularly popular, as while we don't know anything about the Empire's attitudes towards children born out of wedlock, for a beloved ruler to have kept it secret, and then her young daughter to openly flout it, well, you can imagine that this might incense the conservative aristocracy that originally backed the Lord Ruler. This question of legitimacy and what gives someone the right to rule is at the very heart of Dishonored 2. And as Emily sits upon her throne, awaiting the start of the celebrations, this ambiguity comes marching in through the front door. She is informed by the captain of the Royal Guard that she has a visitor from the southern continent of Serkonos, Duke Luca Abel, the master of Karnaca, a wealthy mining city that enjoys a lush tropical climate and a light touch from the crown. Flanked by a set of terrifying mechanical soldiers, which immediately put Corvo on edge, the Duke strides into the throne room and declares that he has brought with him the greatest gift of all: family. Amidst the gasps of the court, he declares that he has discovered Jessamine Caldwin's long-lost sister and the rightful ruler of the Empire, Delilah Caldwin. As she approaches the throne, Corvo immediately claims deception, but Delilah seems unfazed. She declares to the court that she is here to bring the Crown Killer to justice, and as the Duke hails the Empire's new ruler, the throne room erupts into chaos. As the Clockwork soldiers tear through the palace guard, Corvo attempts to dispatch the usurper, but as he drives his blade into her chest, we see it pass straight through as if it was smoke, leaving Delilah free to disarm him and strip away his supernatural powers. The camera then pulls back, and we see that both father and daughter are utterly surrounded, and this prompts the most impactful choice in the entire game, selecting the protagonist of the story and the character which we will play as. Now, this decision has a pretty big impact on the gameplay, which we'll explore in the next section, but for now I want to highlight a big shift from the previous game, which we can see right from the moment we pick our character. Rather than sticking with a silent protagonist where you exist solely as an observer, Arkane Leon made the decision to give Corvo and Emily a voice, something they dabbled with in the last game's DLC but is much more prevalent in the sequel. This has the twin benefit of creating much more natural sounding conversations with the game's many NPCs, and enables Arkane to have Corvo or Emily make little comments in response to the things that we see. These add a lot of flavour to the experience, either giving an insight into how our character is feeling, making observations about the world that build our understanding, or even subtly directing the player towards objectives. On top of this, just like in the DLC, in between levels, we now see short animated cutscenes, where our chosen character reflects on the things they've done, and this provides a lot more character development than Corvo's previous unwavering stoicism. Thanks to great performances by both Erica Luttrell and Stephen Russell, who famously voiced Garrett in the Thief series, both protagonists feel like fleshed out, realistic people, and regardless of who you pick, the story works with either in the lead role, and gives you a subtly different perspective depending on if you're hearing the world-weary cynicism of Corvo or the naive idealism of Emily. So, depending on this choice, Delilah seals the other in magical stone, and commands that the traitorous Captain Ramsay, who was secretly in league with the Duke, lock our protagonist away in the royal chambers. This brings us to the start of the game proper, where we're tasked with first escaping the tower and then finding passage out of Dunwall, a short sequence designed to add some more context to the narrative and allow us to get to grips with Dishonored's unique stealth action gameplay. Now, what's curious about this section is that it is very much not a tutorial, and the process of taking out Captain Ramsay, leaving the tower via a secret hideaway, and then working your way through the streets is pitched at a much higher level of difficulty than you might expect this early on. Without any powers and up against much more perceptive enemies, you really need to think about how you approach situations, especially if you're intending to play stealthily and go after those no detection achievements. Now, this might sound like an odd way to start the game, but it was entirely intentional, as according to Dinga Bakaba, Dishonored 2 originally opened in a totally different way that ended up being scrapped in favour of throwing in players at the deep end. The original version was much longer and revolved around Emily and Corvo christening a ship and then having to fight off a rebel attack, which served as both a traditional tutorial and a way to contextualise more of the world after the 15-year time skip. Apparently it was decided that the sequence was bloating the early game, so a separate tutorial was created which you access from the main menu, and the first hour was reworked so that from the moment we take control of either Corvo or Emily, we are getting full-fat Arkane level design. So, while the streets of Dunwall are still far less complex than the levels we'll see later in the game, it's still full of clever little details and alternative paths that reward player exploration. We can break into the home of Ichabod Boyle, a vocal critic of the throne, and see the grisly work of the Crown Killer with our own eyes. We can infiltrate the offices of the Dunwall Courier and protect an editor being shaken down by the Duke's men, who then agrees to publish loyalist articles. We can abduct the traitorous Mortimer Ramsay and seal him away in Emily's den, and even rob the apartment of one Dr. Galvani, who apparently had moved closer to the tower after his last home was continually ransacked during the plague. The fact that all of this is available to us before we've even gotten our powers really shows that Arkane was serious about pushing Dishonored's level design to a whole new level, and while it's perfectly possible to blast through everything in a matter of minutes, there's so much colour and hidden detail to discover, a philosophy that will underpin almost every single moment of this game. While that bodes well for the rest of our playthrough, it should also be noted that it comes with a glimpse of dark clouds on the horizon, as when we arrive at the docks and board the dreadful whale, we encounter some pretty strange narrative decisions. Turns out that the ship is captained by a woman named Megan Foster. She'd come to Dunwall seeking an audience with the Royal Protector after discovering a conspiracy involving the Crown Killer in Karnaca, but had arrived too late to prevent the Duke and Delilah's plans. Unfortunately, Foster has more bad news. She had been working with Anton Sokolov, the genius natural philosopher who aided Corvo during the time of the Lord Regent, but during their investigation, he was abducted. Regardless of who you've chosen to play with, the two decide that the only feasible plan is to head down to Serkonos to rescue Anton Sokolov and investigate the Crown Killer, as this will surely reveal how Delilah was able to gain such terrible power and provide the key to her downfall. This is the conceit by which we leave Dunwall and head to Karnaca, where the vast majority of the game takes place, but I've got to say that it feels quite forced compared to the sleek premise of Dishonored 1. In that game, Corvo's sole purpose is to avenge the death of Jessamine Caldwin, and this acts as an overarching goal that links everything from the targets we hunt down to his use of the Outsider's gifts and his alliance with the Loyalists at the Hound's Pit pub. By comparison, Dishonored 2 isn't anywhere near as focused, and it feels odd to abandon Dunwall immediately after a bloody coup and head off on a murder investigation. We should be rallying the troops, seeking out allies, working out how to retake the throne, not travelling across the globe in order to solve a problem that now seems somewhat minor. Had Emily's unpopularity been slightly more established, say with a longer tutorial section that allowed the player to have more insight into why she has no allies, this might have made more sense, but as it stands, we find ourselves en route to Karnaca with only a loose idea of what we're trying to achieve. Much like how the unexpected level of detail and complexity in such a simple level will define the rest of the experience, this lack of narrative cohesion is also a central part of Dishonored 2, and that's without even talking about the reuse of Delilah Copperspoon, which is something we'll address a little later in the video. So we find ourselves aboard the Dreadful Whale, charting a course to the far south in the hopes of finding redemption, and it is here that we meet a familiar face in the darkness of the void. Once again intrigued by the chaotic events swirling around the throne, the Outsider appears before us and offers his assistance, once again bestowing the ability to convert runes into supernatural powers. Along with this, we are also gifted the Mechanical Heart, but this time its connection to Jessamine is much more overt, as we speak directly to her spirit before it enters the device, leaving both Emily and Corvo deeply unsettled at the games that the Outsider is willing to play. Now interestingly, the greater emphasis on voice acting and dialogue seems to have also impacted the portrayal of the Outsider, as Billy Lush's alien and unknowable take on the character has been replaced with a much more colourful performance by Robin Lord Taylor. The justification for this change has never been outright stated, but it seems to be that, despite recording voiceover for the game's trailer, Billy Lush struggled with the amount of work required for Dishonored 2 and was recast in order to keep everything moving. While that sounds reasonable, it is quite a loss considering his deadpan portrayal of the Lovecraftian god was an iconic part of the first game's identity. But as we'll discover later in the video, a new voice actor is the least of the Outsider's worries in Dishonored 2. Anyway, with our meeting in the void concluded, we are thrust back into reality. And as the Dreadful Whale draws into Karnaca's windswept bay, the task of hunting down the Crown Killer and clearing our name finally begins. While Dishonored 2 is in many ways extremely similar to its predecessor, faithfully replicating its core gameplay loop, its assassination-focused objectives, its linear level progression, and its approach to world building, there's also been quite a lot of change, and it goes far beyond the new sun-baked environments. In the hold of the Dreadful Whale, we find Foster has set up a headquarters for our investigation, and this forms a new hub zone, a small space we return to between levels, where we meet with our allies and plan our next moves. Apparently Sokolov had begun to suspect that Duke Luca Abel was planning something sinister, as his management of the city had taken on a rather more brutal tone, something that shocks Emily as she had foolishly presumed that the Empire was being run in a peaceful and prosperous way. Foster tells us that before she could inform the Crown, Sokolov was abducted, and while she wasn't able to catch the perpetrator, she did track them to the Adamaya Institute, a hospital for the rich run by the legendary alchemist Alexandra Hypatia. As the kidnapper is assumed to be the Crown Killer operating out of the facility, the two decide that Hypatia must be confronted, and they head off for Karnaca Harbour and into the first proper level. While that is all very familiar, what comes next is distinctly new, as the urban sections that lead up to the larger levels have been redesigned to feel far more vibrant and give us a real dose of Karnacan life. It's a dramatically different atmosphere to the tense streets of Dunwall, and where we previously skulked through shadows and avoided warring gangs, Karnaca feels a lot more peaceful, and we get to see the people going about their everyday lives, working on the docks, selling goods from stalls and drinking at bars. In tandem with the glorious sunshine, the colourful painted buildings and the lush trees looming over the cityscape, it really does feel like we're on the other side of the world, and it triggers this natural desire to explore, as you want to find out more about this strange new place. Now what's cool is that this feeling of experiencing a slightly different culture is present even in tiny little details, and it's clear that Mitan and his art team really thought about how Sarkonis would develop differently to Dunwall. For example, the Sarkonan Grand Guard who supposedly protect the streets all wear short-sleeved shirts to help cope with the heat, and rather than seeing shelves stocked with whale meat and tinned goods, the people of Karnaca eat fresh fruit and turn grapes into wine. Everything that would have been seen in Dunwall has an equivalent Karnacan design, even down to the shape of the money, and it's a level of care in the way the environments have been constructed that you rarely see from even the greatest of developers. Now, what makes this even more impressive is that these seemingly aesthetic touches also bring with them some subtle improvements to the gameplay, and it's clear that Mitton's team must have been working closely with the level designers and animators. Rather than the peaked British-style roofs of Dunwall, Karnaca's buildings almost always have rooftop terraces and wide-open balconies, presumably so the owners can enjoy the weather. But these two architectural features add a lot of verticality to the urban spaces and give you interesting ways to get in and out of buildings. Similarly, the distance from Dunwall's slaughterhouses has forced the city away from relying entirely on oil. We frequently find walls of light that are powered by wind turbines, a distinctly Karnacan solution that harnesses the fierce winds that blow in from the city's silver mines. Now, the big headline piece of world building that is also gameplay comes in the form of bloodflies, a flying parasite that acts as the sequel's plague rat substitute. Unlike the rats, bloodflies are native to Karnaca and lay their eggs in the flesh of living beings, humans and animals alike. This usually results in a fatal illness called bloodfly fever, which eventually results in the bodies of the dead being used to form hives, which the flies will then defend with territorial viciousness, and which make buildings impassable in the case of a wide infestation. This requires both quarantine and the intervention of a smoke flash crew, but as we discover upon our arrival, the budget for all this has been brutally slashed by Duke Luca Abel, and Karnaca is now really struggling as the flies are spreading at an almost uncontrollable rate. It makes for these wonderful visuals, where entire buildings have been boarded up to try and keep the flies in, and creates real moments of panic, while you open a door or blink into an open window, only to discover that there are hives all around you. Of course, you can burn the nests away yourself or simply slash them to pieces, but this is loud work, and if you're trying to achieve your goals without anyone noticing you're there, an infestation of bloodflies can often be harder to deal with than an outpost full of Sarkonan guards. At the risk of repeating myself, it's just so impressive that every single component of Dishonored 2 serves multiple purposes within the design, harnessing the artistic talent of Mitton's team, providing some sort of interactive quality, adding flavour to the world, and essentially making Karnaca a joy to travel around. Now, on the subject of movement, it does have to be said that while the switch to the Void engine has brought with it a much higher ceiling on the visuals, it also changes the fundamental feel of the game, and that can be a bit of a mixed bag depending on your perspective. Dishonored 1 was a very fast-paced game with almost zero input delay, while this made for extremely snappy gameplay. Especially when you're playing as a fully upgraded Corvo or Dowd, it did make the game quite easy. By comparison, Dishonored 2 is slightly more slow-paced, and there's a far greater sense of momentum and weight behind your actions, especially when crouching, as there's now a noticeable delay after you press the button and switch into stealth. For some people, these changes were a huge mistake and totally ruined the hyper-responsive game feel that made the original feel so fun, but I think they were done with genuine purpose. Not only did Smith and his team want to bump up the challenge, which slowing down the player would certainly achieve, but it also adds an immersive quality, as it really feels like our character exists as an object within this world, rather than just a set of floating hands. It's most evident in the changes to how the lean mechanic works, as in Dishonored 1 this left you totally invisible and made it extremely easy to look around corners and avoid guards while in cover. In Dishonored 2, you're now totally visible, which actually makes a lot more sense and forces you to think harder about your positioning. Now, I actually prefer the feel of the original, but the change is a small cost to pay in order to play around with Dishonored 2's new gameplay concepts. As while the format is still the same, Arkane have served up a hell of a lot of new ways to create chaos in Karnaca. The first we're introduced to before we even arrive in the city, as you now have a much larger spread of options when trying to play non-lethally. You can now knock out guards while dropping from above and trigger a takedown while in combat. Two small additions which add an entirely new gameplay archetype, the high chaos, low lethality playthrough, which allows you to go guns blazing while still working within restrictions. It's actually a lot of fun to try and cause as much injury as possible without killing anyone, and this idea of adding more ways to play seems to have been central to Arkane's approach. The most outright obvious change is that depending on your chosen character, you'll have access to two completely different sets of powers, and impressively, Arkane have managed to make Emily and Corvo feel distinct enough to warrant 2 playthroughs. Corvo brings back all the old favourites from Dishonored 1, which means you're blinking between rooftops, freezing time to take out enemies, possessing unwitting guards and peering through walls with dark vision. Much like in the last game, it's a supremely satisfying arsenal of tools, blending infinitely gratifying animations with lots of scope for experimentation. His powers still have lots of different uses and aren't strictly designed around either stealth or action. Now in Emily, we have the same open-ended philosophy, but it's based around a set of abilities which try to bring something new to the formula. For example, rather than blink, Emily has Far Reach, a spell that works something like a Spider-Man web sling, reaching out across space and pulling her towards the target location. That might not sound very different, but as you're actually moving through space rather than teleporting, there's a real momentum to the action. If you use it while running, you can slingshot yourself far further than the normal range, and this is something that can be both a blessing and a curse, allowing you to cover vast distances, but also preventing you from using it as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Now on top of this, most of Emily's powers have a distinctly otherworldly flavour to them, and unlike Corvo's more traditional magical skills, she comes across like she's accessing something truly twisted and dark. Take Shadow Walk, which we saw during the game's cinematic trailer, which transforms Emily into a shadowy wraith, enabling much faster movement and the ability to instantly pull off assassinations. Similarly, we've got Mesmerize and Doppelganger, 2 skills that involve pulling ethereal beings out of the void, one which can be used to distract enemies and the other fighting alongside you. They look and feel great, but the pick of the bunch is Domino, a simple ability that ties the fate of NPCs together, causing what happens to one to happen to the other. The satisfaction that comes from taking out an entire room with just a single crossbow bolt cannot be overstated, and there's even the scope to use it in some particularly sinister ways, like tying together a convict and his executioner, and watching as the killer unwittingly condemns himself. Where Corvo feels like an amalgamation of all your favourite superheroes, Emily's skills are far more demonic, like you're doing things a human really shouldn't be able to do, and it adds a wonderfully sinful side to the deal made with the outsider. This alone would be enough to warrant 2 separate playthroughs, but even within a singular run, there is lots of choice about how you want to build your version of Corvo or Emily, that goes even beyond the stealth versus action and non-lethal versus lethal dynamics. You see, rather than having just a single upgrade for each power, we now have miniature skill trees that give us 3 or 4 different options for modifiers, and these can often be as impactful as acquiring a new power altogether. For example, through Corvo's Blink tree, we can add Redirective Blink, which freezes time while aiming the ability, just like Dowd could in the DLC. Or we can upgrade Emily's Doppelganger so that it can carry out assassinations from stealth, or improve Domino so that it can chain 3 or even 4 enemies together. This gives the whole system of collecting runes much more legs, as unlike in the last game, where you could max out your favourite power long before the halfway point, it keeps the hunt for upgrades relevant well into the late game, as there is always something worth improving. Now, of course, the powers and runes were always only half of Dishonored's progression equation, as we also need to scavenge through apartments and offices looking for money and valuables to cash in on upgrades to your gear. This has seen quite the rework from Dishonored 1, and while we still acquire funds in the same way, how we spend them has a uniquely Sir Conan flavour. Rather than doing our shopping in between levels back at the hub, we now have to find black market shops out in the wild, which are typically hidden away from the prying eyes of the Grand Guard. Each level has its own shop, and generally speaking, we're free to visit whenever we want, which totally shifts the relationship between the gameplay, our equipment, and the process of finding resources. In Dishonored 1, Pierrot's shop was more like preparing a loadout, where you'd scrape together what cash you could find and then have to make do with what you could afford until the next level. But this is very different in the sequel, where you're free to restock your sleep darts or mana tonics or grenades at any point, as long as you have the coin. Much like the changes to the movement, I'm not sure this actually improves the gameplay, as the enforced scarcity often caused you to have to be creative, rather than always relying on the same old methods. But it does bring with it a lot of immersion, that again makes Karnaca feel much more alive than Dunwall. We walk in on shopkeepers being hustled by local gangs, take on thieving jobs that reward us with extra cash, and even discover a set of burglars trying to blow their way into the storeroom of one particular location. In fact, the shops themselves even carry an element of classic Dishonored grey morality, as it's possible to break into every single one and rob the owner blind. A strategy that rewards you with lots of free items but supercharges your chaos rating and closes down the shop for good. Between two playable characters, the host of powers to choose from, the spread of possible gameplay styles, the beautiful new city to explore, the upgrades to track down, and the side content to absorb your time, there is just a ridiculous amount of game contained within Karnaka's walls. On the surface, this might just look like a colourful version of Dishonored 1 with a new choice of protagonist, but it's clear that Arkane have really thought about what makes the series tick and tried to make subtle changes that add a lot of depth. Something that is very much on show when we finally arrive at the Admire Institute and dive into the first proper mission. Dishonored 1 was at its very best when we were thrown into a large singular space and let loose to hunt down a target however we saw fit. Levels like Dunwall Tower and the Golden Cat formed sprawling immersive playgrounds, full of different ways to achieve our objectives, while rubbing shoulders with the rich at Lady Boyle's party has become the game's iconic mission. It's these highly replayable assassinations that most define Dishonored's legacy. This is why the Admire Institute is such a great first level, as it not only reintroduces us to this formula, but builds on the complexity of the past, presents us with a mission that would feel more at home in the final hours of Corvo's adventure. We arrive at the Institute via a motorised carriage that takes us out across the waves of Karnaka's harbour, a stunning scene that highlights how isolated the hospital is from the rest of the city. This might be a house of healing run by an altruistic doctor, but it's also highly exclusive, a place for the wealthy and influential to have their ailments tended to, away from the prying eyes of the public. Now, when the carriage first pulls into the station, the first thing you'll notice is the sheer scale of the Institute, as this is a far larger location than we're used to seeing. Where the Overseer's headquarters wasn't much more than a 2-level building and a courtyard, Admire takes place over a sprawling 6 floors, each of which has its own unique identity that brings different challenges to the mission. Out in the gardens, we have to deal with wide open spaces that make it easy to be spotted, whereas the dining room is full of furniture that you can hide behind, but also lots of guards gambling and eating food. There are stairwells that are constantly being patrolled, makeshift pens housing bloodhounds, an entire floor that's infested with bloodflies, and even a hidden basement full of confiscated runes, which we can access if we cut the wires to the elevator. For what is ostensibly the first proper level in the game, it is astoundingly complex, and that bump up in difficulty is also present in how Arkane have positioned our foes. If you remember, a big reason they switched engines was to be able to have NPCs moving seamlessly between unique animations and pursuit gameplay, and all this is on show all throughout the Institute. We see groups of men looking out across the bay with a telescope, playing cards on the stairs and interrogating staff members, all presented with their own voice lines rather than just marching around waiting to be taken out by the player. Now, beyond adding personality to the NPCs, this shift also adds complexity to the gameplay, as we now rarely find ourselves dealing with a single foe at a time, and most rooms require quite a bit of planning before you fly into action. In tandem with the slower movement, this makes Admire feel substantially harder than the early game levels in Dishonored 1, but I absolutely love this change, as it really forces you to get creative with your abilities, and makes finding runes and bone charms feel like a meaningful jump in power. Now, the obvious place to start our hunt for the Crown Killer is in the offices of Dr. Hypatia, located up on the 4th floor, and in true Dishonored fashion, there is no singular correct path to get here. In the main lobby, the route to the central stairway is blocked by a wall of light. And while you can of course kill the guards and deactivate the device, there's nothing stopping you from using possession to walk through unimpeded, or climbing around the side of the hospital and entering through a higher floor. Just like in the previous game, this is level design that rewards being inquisitive, and perfectly complements the investigative atmosphere, where we aren't looking to conduct a lightning strike assassination, but instead are looking for clues about what's been happening here. Now, very quickly you'll notice that all is not well within the Institute. When we first arrive in the lobby, we see a mother petitioning the guards, begging to see Dr. Hypatia so she can treat her sick child, but the Grand Guard is under strict orders from the Duke that nobody is to disturb the good doctor. As we explore the building, it becomes pretty clear that nobody has been treated in some time, as not only is most of the Institute in a state of disrepair, but the patient rooms are completely empty. We constantly find letters from troops complaining about boredom and looking to be reassigned. Considering Hypatia's tonics are still being sold in Karnaca, and her apartment is still being cleaned by her staff, it seems like the state of the hospital isn't common knowledge, and as we dig deeper, it's clear that this is being done to mask a terrible secret. In an abandoned office on the first floor, we can stumble across the body of a dismembered guard, a brutal clue that the Crown Killer is here, and inside of Hypatia's office, we learn that she had begun to suspect her own staff. The shortlist is Lieutenant Valiente, a guard suffering with anxiety and insomnia, the Institute janitor Hamilton, who spends his nights wandering the island muttering to himself, and Hypatia's assistant Vasco, who has begun to avoid the Doctor despite them being incredibly close. Locating these three men gives the rest of the level some structure. After a bit of hunting around, we can discover that Hamilton is the only one still alive, as Vasco hasn't been seen in weeks and Valiente was the poor sod we found on the first floor. Now Hamilton is an interesting character, as it's perfectly possible to entirely miss him, as he's being questioned about his strange behaviour by the Grand Guard on the second floor, and if we take too long to reach him, they'll end up killing him in frustration. If we do manage to save the janitor, we'll find out that he's experiencing a sort of mental breakdown after coming face to face with what he describes as the hooded eyes of hate. So he's clearly not the killer, but this gives us our next clue. In the interrogation room, we can take the key to Hamilton's heavily booby-trapped office, which he's obviously set up in a bout of paranoia. Inside, we can read his diary, where he speculates that Vasco might be the killer, as he hasn't been seen outside of the recuperation room since he was spotted drawing blood from a guard who died of bloodfly fever. It's pretty suspicious behaviour, so getting into the recuperation room and finding Vasco becomes our next objective. Now, if you hadn't already noticed, this is quite a different kind of structure to the way missions worked in Dishonored 1, as instead of just making a beeline to our target, the game ekes out key information in a trail of breadcrumbs that gently leads us all over the Institute. Much like everything else in this sequel, it's a subtle shift, giving us ever so slightly more direction about where we should be going, but importantly, never being so in your face that you can't just ignore the intended path and skip straight to Hamilton or the recuperation room, if that's where your intuition leads you. So regardless of the path you take, you'll end up stepping into the ward and coming face to face with Dr. Alexandria Hypatia. And it is here that Dishonored 2 serves up a neat little twist, which has a massive impact on the rest of the narrative. While Hypatia is accommodating and kind-hearted, she's very confused and seems to be having issues with her memory. She remembers seeing Anton Sokolov in the Institute and knows that he was taken away to see someone called Kirin Jindosh. But beyond that, her mind is foggy, and of the Crown Killer, she knows even less, recognising the name but quickly losing her train of thought. It's confusing considering so much of the level has been building to this confrontation, but there is a dark secret boiling beneath the surface of Adamire. Hidden away at the back of her lab, we find a man laying in a stretcher, his body and face disfigured. It is Hypatia's assistant, Vasco, and he tells us that the Crown Killer is none other than the Doctor herself. Apparently she had been working on an experimental cure for bloodfly fever, but something was wrong with the mixture, and after testing it on herself, she created a menacing and bloodthirsty alter ego, which the game refers to as Grim Alex. Unfortunately, the first man to discover this was Duke Luca Abel, who preyed upon Hypatia's compromised mental state and set her about the work of destabilising Emily's rule, sealing off the Institute and feeding her the names of targets that would best achieve his own goals. Now amazingly, Vasco begs us to spare her, and here lies the level's non-lethal solution, as while we can plunge a blade into Hypatia's back and put an end to the Crown Killer for good, there is another option. Vasco tells us that he was working on an antidote before Hypatia took him, and if we break into his office, we can finish the solution and save Alexandria from the nightmare that is Grim Alex. It's a pretty captivating ending to an extremely impressive first level, showing off everything that Arkane Leon wanted to achieve with the sequel and providing a wonderful slice of exploration, action and world building, that cohesive mixture which made the first game such a hit. From almost every perspective, the Adamire Institute is a roaring success of a video game level, but there is always one thing that's never sat quite right with me, and that is the speed with which we uncover the Crown Killer's identity. While the actual execution of the reveal is done very well, and having it come after we investigate the other suspects gives it a real shocking quality, I've never understood the reason that we had to solve this mystery so early in the game. We're in Karnaca to achieve 3 goals: to discover how Delilah amassed so much power, to find Anton Sokolov and to uncover the Crown Killer, and it feels odd to have solved one of these tasks after just a few hours in the game, despite it being presented as a major roadblock in Emily retaking the throne. Even more confusingly, this revelation that Karnaka's beloved doctor was murdering critics of the crown on the orders of the Duke doesn't really have any major impact on the rest of the story. In Dishonored 1, you'd see future targets becoming increasingly paranoid as their allies were picked off, and wanted posters appearing all around the city, making it feel like our actions within a single level were part of a greater whole. In Dishonored 2, this never really comes together as we can't see what's happening back in Dunwall, and thus we don't get the narrative reward of seeing Delilah's rule weakened by our actions. When we step back into Karnaka, the city feels no different for us removing the Crown Killer from the streets, and it's not even mentioned by any of our future targets. It's another example of a lack of narrative cohesion, where plotlines don't feel entirely complementary with the level design or gameplay. Something that is quite disappointing, considering every other element of our trip to the Admire Institute shows a studio firing on all cylinders. Now, up until this point, our journey across Karnaka has been defined by the impact of subtle adjustments to the existing Dishonored formula. But in this next section of the game, Arkane utterly abandons that reserved approach in favour of a monstrously ambitious new concept. Thanks to the information gleaned from Dr. Hypatia, we know the name of our next target, Kirin Jindosh, the grand inventor of Serkonos and a man whose fingerprints are all over the city. You see, he is the creator of the Clockwork soldiers that put Delilah on the throne. So while we need to pay him a visit in order to rescue Sokolov, there's also the matter of his support for the Kaldwin usurper, a crime that neither Emily or Corvo will allow to go unpunished. Now, just like with the Admire Institute, Megan doesn't just drop us off at a conveniently placed dock, and we have to make our way across the multi-tiered Avon district in order to get to Jindosh's mansion. Just like before, it's a small sequence of gameplay that gives Arkane a chance to further build the character of Karnaka, and it's here that we get a feel for its dark underbelly. Unlike Dunwall, which was in a state of open chaos, collapsing under the weight of the plague and various warring factions, Karnaka's corruption is much more insidious, lurking under the surface of a city that is supposedly peaceful and prosperous. As we work our way towards Jindosh, we see beggars in the streets, thugs brazenly robbing passers-by, guards content to let it happen. In many ways, this slow but unstoppable decline feels far more realistic than what we saw in the first game. As while plagues and fires and warfare can bring nations to their knees, the sinister effects of greed and mismanagement can often be just as destructive. It only reinforces that Emily Kaldwin was not a particularly effective empress, and by allowing such rot to set into an important province of her empire, she was creating many of the opponents that we now find ourselves cutting down. Dishonored 2 does a great job of asking if you are truly justified, and if birthright alone is enough to warrant having power. It's a captivating thought that will be challenged even further as we progress on our crusade, but for now we need to rescue Sokolov and deal with Jindosh, a task that takes us to his vast clifftop estate. Now curiously, when we arrive, rather than finding high walls protected by guards and complex security systems, we find the front door unlocked and are free to enter the inventor's home without any resistance. Inside, the strange mansion appears to be formed of just 2 rooms, filled with sculptures, display cabinets and a single audiograph that informs us of what exactly we are dealing with. Through the machine comes the voice of Kirin Jindosh, who tells us that while the doors of his home are open to everyone, if you hold ill intentions, leaving may be substantially harder than getting in. All we can do is pull a lever in the next room, and with that, Jindosh and Arkane unfurl their masterpiece. The walls pull back, the floors and ceilings come apart, and we witness one of the greatest levels in video game history transforming around us. The Clockwork Mansion. Now, in interviews during the run-up to Dishonored 2's release, the Clockwork Mansion played a huge part in the game's advertising, and it was something that the team was obviously extremely proud of. According to Harvey Smith, it was the brainchild of lead design director Christoph Carrier, and much like how Smith would always propose putting a real-time day and night system into every game that they worked on, Carrier was obsessed with the idea of a level where players could manually switch between different layouts. Now, while the day and night cycle never made it into Dishonored 2, Carrier did get the go-ahead for his dream level. And while everyone else in his design team worked on 2 or 3 different sections of the game at once, he put together a small group that worked exclusively on the Clockwork Mansion. One of these developers was Dana Nightingale, and in a series of interviews with Game Maker's Toolkit and NoClip, she described that while they were all excited to put together something so original, the concept brought with it a ludicrous set of challenges. For starters, the team decided early on that they didn't want to have any cheats with the level geometry, or hide pieces of the scenery clipping into one another behind walls. This meant that not only did transformations need to be functional from a design and aesthetic perspective, but they also needed to be mechanically sound and operate as if they really did exist. On top of this, the level's constantly shifting structure played havoc with NPC AI, as they needed to not only fulfill their purpose within the game, but be able to do so in 2 different versions of the mansion, which could be active at any one time. This required a complete rewrite of how the game's NPCs navigated level geometry, and essentially made the Clockwork Mansion a mini game within a game, complete with its own rules and developmental tricks. Now, originally the mansion had been envisaged as more of a dungeon, with the idea being that Jindosh used mechanical traps and deadly logic puzzles to test the morality of the player, but as development progressed, this started to feel a little out of step with the grounded atmosphere of the rest of the game, so the insanity was pared back. What we're left with is a far more believable location, that despite the ludicrous premise, somehow feels like it could potentially exist, like someone does actually live here. It's just that they're a maniac inventor with a love of toying with his guests. So once we trigger the first transformation, we hear Jindosh speak over the mansion's loudspeaker system, welcoming us into his home and inviting us up to the atrium, where we can meet face to face. Here we see the man himself, casually sauntering towards us and immediately deducing who we are. Jindosh knows that we must have come for both him and Sokolov, but rather than running in fear or alerting the Duke, he arrogantly tells us to go ahead and try. Now, Jindosh is a target like none other in the series, as rather than being hidden away in some corner of the level, only interacting with us at the point of a blade, he plays a very active role. You see, the mansion is rigged with all manner of pressure plates and sound-sensitive machinery, and this allows the inventor to track our progress and constantly comment on our actions in a way that is highly reactive to your behaviour. He'll explain his research and describe the architecture of his home as you discover new areas. He'll comment on your role as Empress if you're playing as Emily. He'll accuse you of common thievery if you steal his belongings, and he'll even become confused if you use your supernatural abilities and confound his instruments. With almost 140 unique lines of dialogue, Jindosh is a constant companion, and I love what this commentary brings to the level, almost making it feel more like the Stanley Parable than Thief or Deus Ex, and either motivating you to put an end to his annoying taunts, or pushing you to simply discover what he's going to say next. Now, the other area where Jindosh looms large is in his Clockwork soldiers, who patrol the hallways of his home and provide a real step up in challenge. They're first introduced in a non-lethal capacity, appearing in the central atrium and giving us a chance to get a closer look before Jindosh issues his challenge and they turn hostile. Along with being able to take out Emily and Corvo in just a couple of hits, what sets them apart from the guards is that they don't have to be facing you in order to detect you, and will sense your movements from any direction. This turns them into serious obstacles in your exploration, and means you either need to expend a huge amount of mana getting around them, or carefully plan ambushes in order to take them out. As they have reinforced armour that prevents headshots and are impervious to most void powers, this usually takes the form of Dishonored 2's gadgets, which have seen a bit of an upgrade from the last game. While the spring razor mines, rewire tools and grenades from Dishonored 1 make their return, we now also have a sticky grenade and a non-lethal option in the arc mine, which lets off an electrical shock and knocks out most foes. Any combination of these can be used to take out the Clockwork soldiers, but as you can only carry a very limited amount, and there's no shop to resupply inside of Jindosh's mansion, it creates this interesting dynamic where you have to pick and choose your moments, potentially leaving a Clockwork soldier alive so that you can take out another later. Now, as if that wasn't enough reason to love this addition to the formula, they also come complete with their own Kirin Jindosh voice lines, as the inventor has recorded a huge spread of responses to situations that he thinks the soldiers will encounter. Obviously, the main purpose is to alert the player to the actions of the robots, but they're also extremely funny. and hearing the machine declare that its own head has been detached, or that it's discovered another dead body without a shred of surprise or emotion, well, it adds even more character to both Jindosh and his strange home. Now, as wonderful as all this is, the real star of the show is the structure of the level itself, and how the team at Arkane have managed to take such a chaotic mess of mechanics and stitch them together into something that feels totally cohesive. While the mansion's transformations might look utterly mind-bending, there is importantly only ever 2 modes to each room, and this means that with just a bit of back and forth, it's quite easy to understand how everything fits together. In addition to this, the mansion is divided into 5 distinct regions, all with their own aesthetic design. The atrium where we entered, the guest rooms which have lots of guards and a huge glass waterfall, Jindosh's bedroom, which is the only area that allows us to view Karnaca, the testing floor where Sokolov is being held, and the laboratory where Jindosh watches our progress. These are purposefully split up by doors that don't transform or move, and a central elevator that links the facility's 3 floors, and this provides a subtle separation that helps the player build a mental picture of the level and prevents you from constantly having to reference a map. Now, the real beauty is that while the mansion is divided into clear sections, there's nothing stopping you from moving between them seamlessly, as it's perfectly possible to get behind the transforming mechanisms and run around like a rat in the walls. It adds a whole extra dimension to the level, giving you new routes to escape Clockwork soldiers, interesting angles to ambush guards and staff members, access to a host of hidden runes and bone charms, usually found on the bodies of burglars that never made it out, and a whole extra set of reactive voice lines, where Jindosh will become confused about you disappearing from his monitors and moving between rooms with such speed. It's just a ridiculously detailed level, where the designers have thought of almost everything you could possibly want to do within this space, and then have come up with some kind of in-game response that acknowledges your effort. In fact, it's even possible to beat the entire level without alerting Jindosh to your presence, as you can get behind the walls before you activate the first transformation and take the inventor out without him ever knowing that you were inside his house. Realising that this is possible is just such a wonderful light bulb moment, and it's so impressive that Arkane were happy enough to allow players to skip all of this meticulously crafted content as long as they were perceptive enough. Now, according to Dana Nightingale, she had imagined the end of the level building on these ideas, leaving the fate of Kirin Jindosh up to the player, allowing them to spare him if they wanted to, and resolving the level once we rescue Sokolov. While it would have beautifully tied into the open-ended nature of the mansion, it was apparently too expensive, as it would require the rest of the game to account for Jindosh either living or dying in cutscenes and dialogue, and so the decision was made to stick to lethal and non-lethal outcomes. It's a tad disappointing, but there's still plenty to chew on, especially in the non-lethal solution. Through our exploration of the mansion, we can discover that Jindosh had originally wanted Sokolov to join him and help mass produce his Clockwork soldiers. When the old man refused, Jindosh had imprisoned him and began using electroshock therapy in an attempt to burn away his free will, while leaving his intelligence and creativity. It's a bafflingly cruel plan, and one which we can turn against the inventor. In his laboratory, we can power up the electroshock chair and strap Jindosh in, wiping away his brilliance and leaving a confused husk of a man. Someone with nothing but cloudy memories of greatness and no way to piece them back together. Much like in the last game, this non-lethal solution is almost more horrifying than just killing him, but as it leaves Delilah and the Duke without a way to build any more Clockwork soldiers, the mind of the most brilliant man in the Empire seems a small sacrifice to make. So as we leave the mansion with Sokolov and head back down through the Avon district, it feels like waking up from a dream, stepping back out into Karnaca and the normal rules of engagement, a world where the walls stay put and the floors don't move. It's a strange sensation, and one that acts as a testament to the sheer immersive brilliance of the Clockwork Mansion. To even attempt to create something like this would normally be enough to win any developer huge amounts of acclaim, but for Arkane to have actually pulled it off, to have fashioned a level that so expertly toys with your expectations of video game level design, well, that is an achievement that deserves to go down in history. If you haven't already, you owe it to yourself to see it in action. And if you've already marvelled at the genius of Kirin Jindosh, well, why not pull that lever and see it all over again? So as we return to the Dreadful Whale, ready to continue our campaign against Delilah and strike out at our next target, you'd be forgiven for being taken aback by the sheer quality of Dishonored 2 up until this point. While there have been a few wonky moments of narrative, and the new engine might be an acquired taste for some, it's hard not to be enthralled by its level design, its art direction, its world building, its creativity and sheer replayability, all of which are on a level you rarely see from even the very best video games. For about 5 or 6 hours, Dishonored 2 is genuinely one of the greatest sequels that's ever been put to disc, and this is why it pains me to talk about what comes next, because alongside all these incredible highs sit some very real lows. Before we head off on our next mission, our protagonist is awoken by the strange call of the void, but it is not the outsider beckoning us into its mystery. Here we once again come face to face with Delilah, and hear how it is her past that is driving her lust for vengeance against the Caldwins. We discover that she is Jessamine's illegitimate sister, sired by the late Emperor Yuhorn but kept at arm's length despite being raised in the tower. While she felt her and Jessamine were close, one day the young heir blamed a broken valuable on Delilah, and this led to her and her mother being thrown out of high society and into the brutal streets of Dunwall. Here life was relentlessly cruel, and after watching her mother die in a poorhouse, Delilah began to fight back, scrambling out of poverty thanks to her skill as a painter, before eventually catching the eye of the outsider and putting his gifts to work as the Witch of Brigmore. When the performance ends, both Corvo and Emily raise their doubts about the veracity of Delilah's story, but have no way to know for sure. Is it an illusion designed to confuse and demoralise, or was Jessamine not quite the woman we imagined her to be? As we sometimes see her spirit emerge from the mechanical heart, speaking to us in wistful and distant tones, this idea of the conflicting legacy of powerful people looms large in our adventure, and it does an excellent job of gently subverting the ideas of the previous game. Did we presume that Jessamine was a good person simply because she was our mother or lover? Was the kind old Emperor Yuhorn who took in Corvo actually a cruel womanizer? Has the Caldwin dynasty even been good for the Empire and its citizens? Similarly, it creates an interesting parallel between Emily and Delilah, as both women were born of questionable parentage and both assumed the throne by force, one thanks to the power of the Duke and the other thanks to the actions of Corvo Attano. Compared to the more traditionally villainous Lord Regent, it makes for a refreshing blur between the protagonist and antagonist, one that is particularly stark when you're playing in high chaos and spilling a river of innocent blood as you try to reclaim the throne. From this perspective, our second meeting with Delilah adds some much needed depth to the familial conflict, but it also raises some issues which I think the narrative struggles to overcome. The first is that the delivery of Delilah's backstory is surprisingly dull, and runs counter to the immersive style that defined Dishonored 1's storytelling. In that game, we pieced everything together ourselves, and it gave the narrative this wonderful natural quality, where key moments could be missed if you weren't paying attention. This is a big part of why Dishonored 1 was such a great game, because while the gameplay is all about empowering the player to act however they wanted, the narrative also works along these lines, and lets you go as deep or as shallow as you want. Dishonored 2 breaks from this style by explaining Delilah's backstory in what is essentially a lengthy expository cutscene. While the actual content might be interesting, it's just a far less elegant way of delivering this information that removes all of that engaging player choice. Considering the relationship between gameplay and narrative was one of the series' strongest points, it's a disappointing step backwards. But what's even more frustrating is that this comes paired with another major issue. The elephant in the room is that we have already learnt about, battled and then defeated Delilah Copperspoon in the Knife of Dunwall and Brigmore Witches DLC, where she served as the foil to Dowd the Assassin's journey of redemption. This puts the writing in Dishonored 2 into a very strange position, as it needs to both be able to introduce the character to new players, but also not constantly retread things that existing fans will have already seen. Unfortunately, I don't think Arkane walks this line very well, and despite literally presenting Delilah to us in 2 detailed cutscenes, there are lots of elements of her character that feel underexplored or go entirely unexplained. For example, her relationship with Anton Sokolov, how he rescued her from poverty thanks to her skills as a painter, is rarely brought up while you're aboard the Dreadful Whale, and oddly, his intimate knowledge of this early part of her life never has any sort of impact on the plot. Similarly, there is a plot hole via omission, as despite Dowd risking his life to defeat Delilah, a decision that is central to his character's story, he doesn't show up once during Dishonored 2, something that feels like it undermines the excellent story at the core of the DLC. It's just so odd that Arkane didn't create an entirely new character for this role, and it ends up coming across like a set of recycled ideas rather than a truly fresh story. Something that is particularly frustrating when it feels like the world of Dishonored is so utterly overflowing with possibility and potential. Now, unfortunately, this same problem bleeds into the next mission, which has an eerily familiar feeling to our experience playing as Dowd in the DLC. In the hull of the Dreadful Whale, Sokolov and Foster agree that the next target should be Brianna Ashworth, curator of the Royal Conservatory, a frequent visitor to Jindosh's mansion, and a close ally of Delilah's. According to Sokolov, she's working on a mysterious machine called the Oraculum, and as she's renowned for her obsession with the occult, eliminating this scheme can only be a good thing for our band of royal rebels. So once again, we board the skiff, head out across the bay, and end up working our way across a small suburban section of Karnaca before beginning our assault on the conservatory. Now, before I get all critical again, I do want to point out that none of what I'm about to say means you can't have a lot of fun in this mission, as, at the end of the day, it's still Dishonored. Using the supernatural powers to sneak around guards or confront them head on, leaping between rooftops against the beautiful backdrop of the city, hunting down runes and unlocking new aspects to your abilities, reading notes in abandoned apartments, and learning about the motivations of those we are hunting, these are all still extremely engaging gameplay concepts, and they don't get any less fun, even when Dishonored 2 isn't quite at its best. In fact, the conservatory is actually quite a compelling location, and it stands in real contrast to the high security strongholds and domestic homes that we typically infiltrate. The conservatory is essentially a museum, a place where the history of Karnaca is celebrated through exhibitions, and where students of natural philosophy can showcase their discoveries and inventions. Along with the glorious weather, sumptuous food and rich wine, it was one of the main attractions to those visiting the city. But as we discover, Ashworth has transformed it into something far more sinister. When we arrive at the conservatory grounds, we find that it's been closed down under the pretense of a mite infestation. With guards patrolling the streets, a watchtower scanning the shadows, and locks on every door, this seems like an unlikely story, and once inside, we discover why. Brianna Ashworth is a witch, and under the direction of Delilah, she's corrupted this house of learning and has turned it into a new covenstead for her dark sisterhood. The staff lay slaughtered in the halls, blood rituals take place in the offices, and those guards outside, well, they're trying to keep the evil in, rather than protect them. After the sunshine of our arrival in Karnaca and the wonder of Jindosh's transforming manner, the conservatory provides a welcome change of tone, leaning far harder into the cruel darkness of Dishonored's world. But my problem is that this is not enough to create a compelling level. The glaring issue is that just like with the recycling of Delilah as the villain, this mission effectively reuses all of the same concepts that Dowd had to overcome in the Brigmore Manor, but it does so in a much less interesting way. Rather than guards and Clockwork soldiers, we're sneaking around witches, and while they can still teleport and scream in all the ways we've seen before, in the conservatory they largely just sit around in set locations, and their unique powers are never used in a way that forces you to change your approach. The same is true of the Grave Hounds and Bloodbriars, corruptions of animal and vegetable created by Ashworth, but neither of which require any sort of unique strategy to deal with, and again are things we've already seen in the DLC. Hell, there is even a moment where we can speak directly with Delilah through a statue that comes to life, and it's just so strange to see one of the most iconic moments of the DLC lifted and repeated in the sequel. For all the beautiful aesthetics and interesting world building, the Royal Conservatory simply doesn't feel fresh. While you could easily point to the witches as the cause of this malaise, it actually goes even deeper, as there's real repetition in the level's structure. Both the Adamaya Institute and Clockwork Mansion follow the exact same structure as the Royal Conservatory. We move through a section of suburban streets, we infiltrate a large building, we track down a single target, then we make our escape. A process that we have undergone 3 times by this point, and which begins to lose its luster the more often we go through it. Now, in interviews, Harvey Smith would often talk about how he saw this as the classic Dishonored structure, which was something the team were trying to build upon in the sequel. But I think by zeroing in on this, they've missed some of the details about Dishonored 1's excellent pacing. You see, this classic structure actually only existed in 2 levels. The very first where we eliminated High Overseer Campbell and the slaying of the Lord Regent in Dunwall Tower. Everything else deviated from the formula, either by giving us 2 targets that we didn't even have to take out in the Golden Cat, by revolving around abduction instead of assassination on the Caldwin Bridge, by placing us in the middle of a social deduction game at Lady Boyle's party, and even abandoning the non-linear design altogether and creating moments of scripted drama as we pushed through the flooded district. Yes, Dishonored 1 was all about sneaking around massive buildings and choosing between lethal and non-lethal solutions, but it was also bursting with variety, and I think Dishonored 2 sorely misses this. Take how we deal with Brianna Ashworth, for example. While exploring the Royal Conservatory, we discover that she's been entrusted with the job of corrupting the Sisters of the Oracular Order, a well-respected branch of the Abbey of the Everyman that operates like ancient Greek oracles. Of course, as members of the Abbey, they wouldn't dare dabble in the supernatural, and instead they analyse history, observe politics, and pore over data in order to make predictions about what the future holds. In notes and audiographs throughout Karnaca, we can learn that the Order is split in its support of the new Empress, something that dramatically hurts her legitimacy. So Ashworth begins the process of invading their minds via the use of a complex machine called the Oraculum. It's a really interesting concept, but it just doesn't connect with the gameplay, as we never see these sisters in person or experience the impact of their proclamations. They're essentially just set dressing, as in practice, stepping into this world of the occult is no different from dealing with Hypatia or Jindosh. While we're free to assassinate Ashworth in her office, the non-lethal solution involves adjusting lenses in the Oraculum and then turning it on its creator in order to sever her connection to the Void. A solution that is virtually identical to how we dealt with the Grand Inventor. Compared to the horror of handing Lady Boyle over to her stalker or getting a street gang to take out the Pendleton twins, it's just not particularly interesting. And after the soaring creative highs of the Clockwork Mansion, by being merely functional, the Royal Conservatory can appear rather unambitious. Now, individually, the issues we've discussed, the recycled ideas, the lack of player interaction in discovering the narrative, the repetition in mission structure, these aren't gross problems that destroy your fun or make this a bad game, but it's much harder to ignore them when they're colliding together in a single mission. The Royal Conservatory represents a real mid-game low point, and what's frustrating is that this doesn't end when we return to the Dreadful Whale. Before we can return to the good stuff, we've got to take a little detour and talk about an element of video game design that doesn't usually capture the limelight: the impact of a well-designed hub. Now, what exactly do I mean by that, and why is it so important to Dishonored 2? Well, video game hubs are a way to connect the wider game together with a bit more artistry than simply loading into one level after the other or picking your next mission from a menu screen. While the main purpose is still to funnel you between sections of the gameplay, it's done with a more thoughtful eye, giving you a space to have a breather between action, to take in elements of the world that don't suit the regular flow of gameplay, and even in some cases, create unique moments all of their own. The godfather of this whole concept is the mighty Nintendo, who really turned people onto the idea when they released Super Mario 64 in 1996. Now, this game usually receives acclaim for codifying 3D camera controls and movement, and essentially setting the foundation for the modern video game experience, but I think the way it structures its world is just as influential. For those that don't know, the game's various levels are presented as paintings in Princess Peach's castle, and by collecting stars and solving little puzzles, the space slowly opens up and gives you access to an ever-increasing amount of paintings. It's a supremely clever concept for 2 key reasons. Firstly, it gives players a space to practice what would have been an extremely unusual method of control without the pressures of time limits or enemies. And secondly, it creates a sense of a wider world that exists far beyond the boundaries of a single level. This ended up being so successful that it quickly bled into other high-profile 3D platformers, and before long, everyone from Rare to Naughty Dog to Insomniac were framing their level select screens as distinct spaces full of unique gameplay potential. In fact, I'd say that for many games in this genre, the hub spaces are just as memorable as the levels themselves. And thanks to the process of constantly returning to them or spending your first moments in them, areas like Artisans from Spyro the Dragon or Gruntilda's Lair from Banjo-Kazooie have come to define the look and feel of those series. Clearly, when it came to jumping between platforms and looking around in third person, the hub world reigned supreme in early 3D. But the idea was also working its way into other genres thanks to the inventiveness of a rather famous old school RPG. 1 year before Super Mario 64 hit shelves around the globe, Square Enix had put out Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo and had closed out the 16-bit era with a masterclass in 2D storytelling and game design. Now, we could spend hours talking about all the creative ideas that made Chrono Trigger such a classic, but I want to focus on a specific screen, an area called the End of Time. You see, Chrono Trigger initially looks like it's going to be a much more linear experience. When we step out of a portal and discover that every timeline actually links together, and that there are beings living at the end of time, well, it adds a new layer of depth to the story that Square are telling. In a sense, it's actually serving a very different purpose to Princess Peach's castle, placing world building, tone, and narrative progression above the function of tying all the levels together. And as RPGs moved into 3D, this style of closely integrating the hub into the story became very popular indeed. The most famous proponent of this was BioWare, a company which began life developing monstrous RPGs for home computers, but as they shifted across to consoles, they had to find ways to make their worlds feel just as large, but with substantially less resources. This quandary led to the creation of both the Ebon Hawk in Knights of the Old Republic and the Normandy in Mass Effect. Two spaceships that serve not only as their game's central hub, but as a location you're meant to build a real connection with. Here you could spend time with your party members, getting to know them and experiencing shifting dialogue options depending on actions you took whilst out on missions. They would provide a narrative-friendly way to gate side content, framing the segmented levels as distinct planets that you would have to fly between, and they even had their own mini-games, small turret sequences or mining mechanics that added flavour to the fantasy of being a starship captain. In both games, the hubs take on a life of their own and are effectively presented as a non-verbal character, a vehicle that you become so attached to that a sequel destroying one is presented as a serious emotional moment. Effectively, as video games were becoming more advanced, so were the hub worlds. And within a single generation of Mario diving into paintings, we were experiencing full academic careers at Yasogami High, growing from a boy into a man in the Guild of Adventurers, and even travelling through time in the Roivas Mansion. By the time we reached the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, developers' skill at designing these spaces had grown to such an extent that they could even rescue an otherwise deeply controversial game, which is exactly what happened in From Software's Dark Souls 2. Now, Dark Souls 2 was always going to have a tough time, as it was coming out on the heels of one of the most influential games of all time, and had to do so without From Software's genius creator, Hidetaka Miyazaki. The end product proved to be very divisive, with everything from the boss designs to the layout of the world, to the story and even how you level your character, creating enormous amounts of disagreement. But one thing that people universally agree upon is the sheer beauty of its hub, Majula. In practice, it's nothing more than a small collection of buildings resting on a stretch of rugged coastline. But with the wind whistling in from across the bay and a glorious yellow sun setting in the distance, it feels like so much more than just a place to repair your items and increase your level. Thanks to the soothing chimes of its theme and the peaceful way its NPCs go about their quiet lives, Majula isn't just a hub, it's a home. A safe place away from the terrors we battle in the rest of the game. A moment of respite from the unrelenting darkness and challenge that defines the Dark Souls experience. It's the perfect example of how these areas have transcended the connective tissue that they originally began life as, morphing from a flavourful way to pass the time in between levels into a fundamental part of the experience. Now, the reason I wanted to explore this concept in such detail is because much of what made Dishonored 1 so fantastic rested on the back of an absolutely iconic video game hub, the Hound's Pit pub. The pub might not be the flashiest part of its design, but it plays an absolutely fundamental role, and actually manages to deliver on most of the hub ideas that we've just spoken about. On the most basic level, as the headquarters of the Loyalist conspiracy, it exists as a space we return to in between missions, and this alone adds an enormous amount of cohesion to the wider experience. We get a moment to actually feel like Corvo Attano, the human being, to rest and recuperate after the intensity of our missions, and this helps break up the relentless pace in a way that feels realistic. Not only this, but it gives us a natural space to interact with NPCs that we aren't trying to kill, as we can speak with Emily and see how she responds to our actions, learn insignificant details about Piero, Sam and Callista, and even hear little hints that Havelock and Pendleton might not be who we think they are. All things that make the world of Dishonored feel much more alive. This atmosphere of safety and fellowship also means that the pub can play an important role in the climax, as seeing it occupied by soldiers and our friends' bodies laid out in the yard, well, it's a horrifying moment that drives home the collapse of Dunwall in the final few hours. While it is nowhere near as exciting as the supernatural powers, or as immediately striking as the unique art direction, or as obviously clever as the interactive level design, the Hound's Pit pub is a key part of why Dishonored works, and it is sorely missing from the sequel. You see, there is a huge hub-shaped hole in the centre of Dishonored 2 that becomes increasingly hard to ignore as you progress through its missions, constantly returning to the dreadful whale, but never developing the sort of attachment that Corvo made with the pub. In our room we can see our character collecting little trinkets from each mission, and we can also record their thoughts in a diary, which adds a bit more context to their actions. But beyond this, almost nothing actually happens here. Take the NPCs. We really only spend time with Megan Foster and Anton Sokolov, but neither really do anything beyond our mission briefings, and there isn't anything like the character development that we saw from those at the pub. There's no analogue to Emily, responding to our moral choices within the game. No new version of Callista that might give us extra objectives. And while replacing Piero with the Karnakan Black Market adds an interesting dynamic to the gameplay, it robs us of yet another important human connection. While we can have Hypatia and later Aramis Stilton join us for just a brief moment, they don't have much to say, because the game also needs to account for them not being saved, and this can make the Dreadful Whale a surprisingly lonely place. On top of this, there's almost no progression in the space we have to access, and what you see on your first visit is exactly the same as during your last. At the pub, you would unlock the sewers in order to deal with Weepers, open up the kennels to imprison Sokolov, and move Emily into the lighthouse, where she'd leave us notes and have her lessons. Its borders grew as the game advanced, and for the Dreadful Whale to be so static, despite literally being a boat that could easily move around the city, well, it's just an obvious wasted opportunity. Without secrets to find, a shop to return to, and NPCs to check in with, it feels sort of pointless to go there in between each mission, and I think a big part of the problem is that, originally, we weren't actually meant to. You see, in a documentary put together by NoClip, lead game designer Dinga Bakaba spoke about the dearth of content that had to be cut during development. One of the most painful of these was something called the Void House, a totally new way to approach hub design that would bring the connective tissue into the levels themselves. The way that it worked was that you could summon the Void House at any time, by aiming a mystical door at any flat surface. And inside would be a sprawling supernatural hub that housed little mechanics that progressed alongside you on your journey. According to Bakaba, there would be void creatures that commented on your actions, a museum where you could examine treasure and learn about the world, and it would even have gameplay implications, giving you somewhere to escape if you became completely cornered. Apparently it had been cut as the game felt that it had too much overlap with the Dreadful Whale, and that it had some potential to slow down the moment-to-moment gameplay, as menus were able to fulfill much of the same functionality at a fraction of the speed. Personally, I think this was a crying shame. Not only is the Dreadful Whale a very static and uninteresting location, but because it makes the mechanics that were originally associated with the Void House far less interesting. The biggest loser in this respect is Dishonored 2's bone charm crafting, a system that should have been treated like a major innovation for the series, but has now been relegated to something you could potentially miss altogether. You see, originally you would enter the Void House and be able to access a workshop where you could combine and craft bone charms, breaking down those you find in the world and assembling new ones that could stack multiple traits into a single charm. Through this you can do some really cool things like push Emily and Corvo's movement speed far higher than normal, craft a charm that makes drinking tap water fully heal your health and mana, massively increase the duration of powers like possession or void walk, or make yourself virtually impervious to explosive weapons. It's actually a very comprehensive system, but the problem is that without the Void House, everything has been shunted into an optional power that you unlock like any other skill, and it feels very odd to have such a cool new idea hidden away like this. Obviously this has been done because a Bone Charm Workshop would be an odd addition to the Dreadful Whale, but it really highlights how outside of the missions, Dishonored 2 lacks that cohesive space that binds everything together, and really misses an area like the Hound's Pit pub that can slowly start to feel like home. Given the journey to Karnaca and our adventures in the city are presented as if they're taking place over quite a long time, I really don't see why the relationships on the whale couldn't have been better fleshed out, and the ship been crewed by a larger cast of characters that might have given us more of an insight into what it was like for people living in this part of the Empire. As it stands, the dreadful whale simply sits in the bay of Karnaca and acts as a slightly interactive loading screen, a real missed opportunity that highlights the often underappreciated impact of a well-designed hub. Now by this point it probably feels like all of my gushing praise for the beautiful construction of Karnaca and the wondrous Clockwork mansion must have been happening in an entirely different review. But thankfully, Dishonored 2 has another soaring high point where we once again get to enjoy Arkane Lyon at their very creative best. In the basement of the Royal Conservatory, we can find an audiograph recording of Brianna Ashworth discussing Delilah's return, claiming that her and the Duke had discovered one another after hearing whispers from the void, and after a fateful night 3 years ago at Aramis Stilton's mansion, the Witch of Brigmore had been pulled back into this world. So given this name was also mentioned by Hypatia aboard the whale, the logical next step is to hunt him down, and it is here that Arkane finally mixes up the strict mission structure that's defined the rest of the game. You see, Stilton lives in a part of Karnaca called the Bethesda mining district, which is almost entirely populated by citizens who work in the nearby mines. Now, traditionally this was quite a good job, as not only was there always work available for those willing to head underground, but the mine's owner, the aforementioned Aramis Stilton, was a conscientious man who never abandoned his employees' well-being in favour of profits. Sadly, this is no longer the case, as 3 years ago Stilton disappeared and his mansion was sealed off from the rest of the district. In his absence, Duke Luca Abel assumed control of the mines, and under pressure to produce far more silver, safety has been completely abandoned, and the district now lies in ruins, crushed under the weight of injured workers and ecological damage. You see, thanks to the winds that blow through Karnaca, the increased output of the mines is now covering the Bethesda district in dust, burying offices and homes and turning it into a ghetto that the Grand Guard don't even bother to patrol. It's a captivating piece of world building that hammers home the damage that the Duke is doing to the people of Karnaca. But unlike in the Syria Gardens or the Avon district, this actually has an expression in the level's gameplay. Not only have the storms eroded many of the buildings, which transforms them from segmented apartment complexes into sprawling ruins full of snaking pathways, but the storms themselves play an active role in how you approach stealth and combat. When one blows across the district, it is a fierce phenomenon, obscuring your vision and drowning out any noise. Now, this is a double-edged sword, as while it gives you more cover to move around guards and lets you be far more aggressive without having to worry about a raised alarm, it also does the same for your foes. And as we never know when a storm will end, you have to be quick to take advantage without leaving yourself out in the open. This is particularly important to bear in mind, as our goal isn't just to get from point A to point B, as unlike any of the other suburban pre-assassination zones, the Dust District has us weaving back and forth, working out how to solve a pretty unique challenge. You see, Stilton's manor hasn't just been sealed up with boards and nails or a simple key and lock, as the job was given to one Kirin Jindosh, who imprisoned the mine owner with his trademark blend of intelligence and arrogance. Essentially, anyone is free to enter the manor as long as they can solve a riddle, but as we see when we step into the Stilton Manor gatehouse, it is a fiendishly tricky puzzle, which means for most players, they'll need to head out into the district and look for other options. Now fortunately, there are two available, and they each relate to one half of a civil war that has been slowly bubbling beneath the Dust District in the absence of Stilton's leadership. On the one side we have the Overseers, led by Liam Byrne, who are trying to bring the district back under control through devoted faith in the Abbey, and on the other, the Howlers, a well-armed street gang led by the mysterious Paolo. Each one is able to give a cipher that decodes the riddle, but will only do so in exchange for the body of their rival. And this creates a really cool moment of choice that asks us to make a judgment about what is best for the city. Given our history with the Overseers, your first instinct might be to strike at their makeshift compound in the east of the district, and as we approach, you can witness a cold-blooded execution as they go about purifying the slums of any and all occult influence. As they're also blockading roads, preventing normal people from getting to their families and supplies reaching those who need them, Byrne seems like the obvious choice, until we infiltrate his offices and begin to learn more about the man. He had long been suspicious of Brianna Ashworth, going as far as to set up an investigation into her activities. He strongly dislikes the Duke and finds him to be an untrustworthy man guiding Karnaca in the wrong direction. He doubts the actions of the Oracular Order and secretly hopes that they declare Delilah's rule to be illegitimate. Essentially, he has excellent political instincts, and as we can learn from the heart that he has ambition to be High Overseer, he may well make an excellent ally if Emily were to reclaim the throne. So with that information in mind, you might head over to the west of the district, into Howler territory, in order to take out Paolo. But he is yet another man of complex motivation. We see him first in the Avent district on our way to see Kirin Jindosh, where a black market merchant will beg us to hide as the Howlers shake down her operation and demand fresh steel at cutthroat prices. Along with the simple fact that he heads up a crime syndicate, it lulls us into a certain perception, which is then starkly challenged when we sneak inside of his headquarters. Here we see him barter with members of the local union, assuring them that his plans for the district involve lowering the workload for those in the mines, and cleaning the dust out of the streets in order to make Bethesda livable. He might be a scoundrel chasing power, but he's more of a Robin Hood type, listening to music in his bar and serving drinks while the overseers put dissenters to death. It's a fascinating moment of grey morality, where either man can be your target or ally and have it feel perfectly natural. An alliance of convenience with a street thug who has the people in his heart, or the start of Emily Caldwin rebuilding her empire as a land of security and peace. So regardless of how you choose to approach the future of the district, you'll eventually end up back at the Jindosh Riddle. But it is in this lavish room, standing before a vast golden door, that the true beauty of the level can be found. Just like back in the Clockwork Mansion, all of this detailed and carefully designed content is entirely optional, and it's perfectly possible to enter Stilton's home without the aid of Paolo or Byrne, by simply solving the riddle yourself. Now, as I said earlier, that is a lot easier said than done, and that's because it doesn't really work like other video game puzzles, as it takes place entirely outside of the game. You see, while most games dress up their puzzles with unique aesthetics or clever little story justifications, they're always engaged with by doing things in-game, pushing blocks onto switches, combining items in your inventory, or taking specific keys to specific doors. Even when trying to break away from these more conventional ideas, puzzlers like Portal or The Witness still base everything around player interaction and mechanics, and you rarely ever see games that ask you to step away from the experience in order to progress. This is where the Jindosh log is different, as all it gives us is a short piece of text describing a dinner between 5 noblewomen and then 10 rotating plaques which ask us to pair each woman with a specific priceless heirloom. There are no unique mechanics that need to be understood, no clues that Corvo and Emily will mutter while we try to work it out, and to make things even harder, the solution is randomised every time you load into the level, which prevents players from turning to the internet and bypassing the challenge. It means you actually have to engage with the process of solving the puzzle, which means grabbing a pen and a paper and having a good old think. It shows an enormous amount of bravery from the team at Arkane to even consider including something like this, a section of the experience that literally takes you away from playing the game. But I think in tandem with the multiple objectives and moral choice at the heart of the Dust District, it makes for one of the most compelling areas in Karnaca. Many of the best games ever made are defined by a single level, a sequence of gameplay that perfectly captures everything the developers are trying to achieve and burrows its way into our collective consciousness. When you think of Halo 1, you immediately picture the UNSC assaulting Covenant beachheads during the Silent Cartographer, a sequence that tells you everything you need to know about the chaotic sci-fi warfare at the heart of the series. Half-Life 2 might be a sprawling experience full of captivating world building and clever design, but its iconic moment takes place in We Don't Go to Ravenholm, where the game's physics innovations collide with first-person action and put hordes of terrifying zombies between Gordon Freeman and safety. Dark Souls has its titanic battle against Ornstein and Smaug at the peak of Anor Londo. Mass Effect 2 has its suicide mission, giving weight and purpose to all your decisions. Uncharted 2 achieves its full cinematic potential as you leap between the cars of a moving train. Now for Dishonored 2, the Clockwork Mansion is the obvious candidate for its singular defining moment. Its level geometry is innovative in a way we'd simply never seen before. Its gameplay rewards player creativity and begs to be replayed. It's full of secrets and details and clever writing, and really, it's one of the finest pieces of video game level design that's ever been produced. Most studios would dine off of a success like this for the rest of their existence. But what is so special about Arkane Leon and Dishonored 2 is that for all its chaotic ideas and narrative missteps, it has another one of these levels. When we step past the Jindosh lock and into the grounds of Stilton's Manor, there is clearly something wrong with the ex-mine owner's home. The air feels stale, the grounds are abandoned, and its hallways and rooms have been left to decay and rot. It's a disturbing discovery made all the more unsettling by the faint whispers coming from a distant bedroom, where we discover Aramis Stilton sitting at a piano, making little sense and unresponsive to our questions. Here we're greeted by the outsider, who claims that 3 years ago something terrible happened in this house which broke Stilton's mind, and if we want to discover how Ashworth and the Duke brought Delilah back from the void, we'll have to go and experience it for ourselves. So the Black-Eyed God gives us the timepiece, a strange device that forms the central thrust behind our investigation, by allowing us to travel through time. Now, what is incredible about this idea is that it isn't just some special way of dressing up loading areas, or a key that we have to use in specific locations to access a time-travelling animation. No, you can use the timepiece at any point in the level and in any location you want. When activated, you'll trigger a ridiculously satisfying little animation that pops you between two time periods. A present day in the ruins of Aramis's home and the very same spot as it was 3 years earlier. Ruined kitchens become hubs of scurrying servants, collapsed stairways reform in front of your very eyes, and libraries full of art and academic study crumble away under the weight of bloodfly nests. It is incredible to see this mechanic in action, as it is both utterly seamless and utterly convincing. The sort of thing you can only experience in a video game, and exactly what makes the medium so profoundly captivating. Now, while you might feel like an all-powerful time traveller, it comes at a price, as when we step into the grounds of the manor, both Emily and Corvo note that their powers don't seem to work here. The outsider tells us that something in the manor has disrupted the flow of the void, and so, while we can slip between the years with a mere thought, we have to approach our objectives without the comfort of our abilities. Typically, I find this sort of disempowerment rarely works, as while it's intended to prevent the same strategies from being used as a crutch and encourage player experimentation, it's very hard to make playing with less feel as good as playing with more. The Stilton Manor could easily fall into this same trap, as we essentially lose access to the entire progression system that we've spent hours developing. But I think the timepiece manages to avoid this issue by giving us something new to focus on. While we can no longer blink or shadow walk or summon rats, we can travel through time, and this opens up lots of interesting little gameplay ideas that Arkane does a fantastic job of twisting in all manner of directions. The key element is that we're able to look from one time period into another by opening a set of blades on the timepiece, something that was originally implemented so that players wouldn't clip into objects or end up inside of a wall. Thanks to this, we can scope out a room from the safety of the present, which outside of a handful of wild hounds and a slight bloodfly infestation is far less dangerous, and it opens up the possibility of sneaking around guards by appearing behind them or planning time-hopping ambushes. It's certainly less flashy than using domino or freezing time, but it is still extremely satisfying, and is also used in some clever ways that make us think about how we interact with the environment. Early on in the level, we don't have access to the entire mansion, and have to follow one of two curated paths, either heading through Stilton's workshop or making our way through the bathhouse and library, with these mini-sequences intended to introduce you to the concept of doing things in the past to change the present. For example, in the mansion's walk-in safe, we discover that the pathway through to the central foyer is blocked by a large statue, and the only way to move it is to head into the past, where you can cut a rope and smash it into pieces, removing the obstruction in the present. Similarly, outside of the library, we can damage a scaffold holding up a balcony, and when we warp into the present, we'll find that it's now collapsed, which allows us to climb up and into the second floor. It's a very engaging way to use this mechanic, as it ends up impacting not only the core action gameplay, but also puzzle solving and navigation. And when you're working out how to drain a flooded basement in order to grab hold of a rune, or staring into the past waiting for a moment to strike, you really don't feel the loss of the rest of your powers. Now, before we go any deeper into the mansion, we need to talk about how Arkane even managed to come up with this idea, let alone translate it into a fully functional level. Well, just like with the Clockwork Mansion, this concept was formed in the bounteous mind of Christoph Carrier, all the way back in 2009. Back then, Arkane were assisting 2K Marin with the development of Bioshock 2, and one section of gameplay they were working on involved Subject Delta experiencing what the City of Rapture was like in its heyday. This involved seamlessly moving the player between two identical environments that had very different lighting, different art design, and unique NPCs. And the process of creating this small sequence really stuck with Carrier. While in Bioshock 2 it happened just once at a scripted point, Carrier became fascinated with the idea of the player being able to control this transition, and what sort of gameplay could be created by having them experience two levels at once. So when he was made level design director on Dishonored 2, he had an opportunity to make this dream a reality. But what's really impressive is that the underlying mechanics are far less complex than you might imagine. Essentially how it works is that Arkane have created two copies of Stilton's mansion within the same game space. One dressed up like the ruined present, and the well-kept past version positioned directly above it. What happens is that when you activate the timepiece, you're actually being teleported 1,000 units directly upwards or downwards. And this means that the game doesn't ever have to load into a new map, which makes the transition so fast. Thanks to the clever positioning of walls and skyboxes and the lovely animation that accompanies each jump, what is actually a very basic idea becomes something ethereal and otherworldly. Perfect example of how creativity in video game design doesn't always come from complexity. Now back in the level itself, eventually we discover that Stilton's guests, Brianna Ashworth, Duke Luca Abel, Kirin Jindosh and Dr. Hypatia, have locked themselves in the second floor study and are awaiting their host to join them. As we can't access the study in the present, we have to track down Stilton in the past in order to get the code to the study door, a quandary that leads to one of the level's most interesting ideas. You see, throughout the mission, we can learn more about the character of Aramis Stilton, discovering that he was attempting to make masks that would stop workers from developing lung conditions, seeing plans to redevelop the mines so that collapses were less frequent, and even a letter to the unions where he proposes a system of annual leave. Thanks to the heart, we can even find out that he doesn't even really like or support Luca Abel, and is only entertaining the Duke's guests out of a loyalty to his late father, Theodanis Abel, who Stilton believes was a much better leader. Unlike Jindosh or Ashworth, he's clearly a good man caught up in something beyond his understanding, and this means that when we find him in the gardens, debating if he should join the other guests, we might be inclined to be merciful and steal the study door code without hurting him. It's a tiny little moment that you might not even register, but as we'll soon discover, it has huge ramifications for the future of Karnaca. So with the code in hand, we can head to the last remaining area in the mansion and finally discover what happened on that fateful night, and how Delilah escaped her prison in the void. Inside of the study, time is bleeding between the past and present, creating a singular swirl of reality where we can watch the guests conduct a dark ritual. Standing at 5 points of a magical circle, the guests writhe as energy is drawn from them and into the centre, where out of a pool of black shadows steps the reborn Delilah, who immediately pours her essence into a nearby statue and commands the Duke to hide it away. This is the secret to her immortality, and the reason that Corvo wasn't able to cut her down. But in discovering this, we also hand a warning to our nemesis. Across time, Delilah can see that we are watching, and with cold determination, she tells us that we cannot stop her. It's all much more than poor Aramis's mind can take, and he slumps to the floor gibbering madness, driven completely insane by the horror of the void, which is what caused his estate to fall into ruin and the Duke to snatch control of the mines. So with that tragic discovery, our mission is complete. We know that we must destroy the statue housing Delilah's soul if we are to permanently defeat her, and that it is being held by the Duke, so nothing remains but to leave the Dust District and head off into the finale. But there is one final secret hidden away in Stilton's Manor, a potential third version of events that leaves Karnaca with a sliver of hope for the future. You see, while the game never directs you to interact with Aramis Stilton in his garden, and leaves the decision to spare or kill him entirely up to you, it's actually possible to save him from his void-induced madness. If rather than ignoring him, you knock him out, he'll never make it to the ritual and will survive the night utterly unaware of what took place in his study, a sequence of events that immediately changes the present in a dramatic way. Now the Stilton Manor stands in perfect condition, unspoiled by the passage of time and staffed by gentle maids and servants who are happy to let you wander the halls if you conduct yourself properly. In this version of events, the mine never fell under the harsh control of the Duke, and Aramis protects the people from the worst of his excesses, which includes regulating the mine's pollution so dust storms no longer ravage the district. By choosing violence, we actually end up making Karnaca a substantially better place. But the benefits extend far beyond the walls of the Dust District and onto the dreadful whale. You see, when we return to our floating base, we find Stilton has joined our crew at Megan Foster's request. As it turns out, the two were close friends before the night of Delilah's return. In the last timeline, after Aramis withdrew into madness, Foster attempted to break him out of his prison, but failed, losing her arm and eye in the process, a disability which she refuses to discuss at any point in the game. In this new fixed version of Karnaca, the two never lost contact, and Foster never lost her limb, which means we can now draw upon Aramis's hatred of the Duke and learn of a secret passageway in his home, where the crew suspects that we will find the statue of Delilah's soul. It's a piece of information that makes the next mission substantially more straightforward, and gives the decision to rescue Aramis Stilton a concrete gameplay benefit, beyond just the satisfaction of saving the beleaguered people of the Dust District. Like so many other things in Dishonored 2, it's amazing to realise that this is even an option, and to see that it's been properly fleshed out with new environments, unique lines of dialogue, and even new gameplay possibilities. Well, it's just a wonderful cherry on top of yet another incredible level. As I said at the top of this section, most developers would be happy to have produced just one sequence of gameplay at this level of quality. So for Arkane Leon to have done it twice within the same game, well, that is something that deserves to go down in first-person video game history. Dishonored 2 is clearly not a perfect game. It's got big issues with its narrative, there are strange choices with its characters, content was cut that probably shouldn't have been, and as we're about to discover, its ending is riddled with issues. But the thing is, none of this really matters, because when we're talking about what makes a game memorable and why an experience stands the test of time, it's because of moments like the Clockwork Mansion and a crack in the slab. They are both so creative, so well executed, so unlike anything else you can see in any other game, that they make it easy to forgive all manner of sins that might otherwise dampen how bright this game can shine. Not everything worthwhile is immaculate. Not everything with flaws should be discarded. And Dishonored 2 is a stark reminder of this in chaotic video game form. There is an old adage that what goes up must come down, a term that feels very apt when talking about Dishonored 2's finale, a pair of missions that represent everything right and everything wrong with this strange sequel. We begin with the latter, what might be the single worst decision made by the team at Arkane Leon, a particularly odd choice that detracts not only from the narrative in this game, but also in the last. As we leave Stilton's Manor and return to the dreadful whale, we are once again pulled into the void by the outsider, who decides to share with us the story of his creation. 4,000 years ago, he was nothing more than an ordinary man, until he found himself bound to a sacrificial table, used as fuel by a nameless cult in order to create a being of pure chaotic power, the outsider. It's a secret that was discovered by Delilah as she floated through the void, and which she was able to exploit in order to orchestrate her escape, draining energy from the outsider like a parasite, and prompting him to help us in our mission of revenge. Now, this is a common criticism that's been repeated in almost every analysis of Dishonored 2, but this revelation should not have been put into the game, as it demystifies a beautifully enigmatic part of the series' lore, and does so in a particularly clumsy way. In Dishonored 1, the outsider was a mystery, a being that is neither good nor bad, and is aiding Corvo not because he is invested in who holds the throne, but because it amuses him to watch the bloody struggle. The outsider is essentially a narrative device, and by making him into someone with clear motivations and a concrete backstory, that Lovecraftian flavour which underpins the Dishonored mythos becomes so much less interesting. What's worse is that this revelation doesn't even go anywhere. We don't discover what the cult were trying to achieve, we don't see why he was chosen as a sacrifice, and ultimately it has very little to do with the battle between the Caldwins. Just like when we spoke with Delilah in the Void earlier in the game, it feels like a moment of forced exposition. And even if I disagree with the decision to add substance to the Outsider, it really should have been hidden away as something curious players could discover by exploring levels and finding in-game clues. The only upside of this sequence being so divorced from the rest of the game is that it has almost no impact on what comes next, and before you know it, we're infiltrating the Grand Palace of Serkonos and putting an end to the twisted reign of Duke Luca Abel. Now on the surface, this climactic level might look like it's repeating all the same mistakes as the Royal Conservatory, serving up yet another small urban area that we have to make our way across, taking place in a large isolated building, and yet again sticking to the single target assassination structure. Well, interestingly, this brings us to another case of cut content, as originally the infiltration of Luca Abel's palace was where Arkane had planned to stage their sequel to Lady Boyle's Party. We can see from concept art that in this early version of the level, the aim was to infiltrate a masked ball and break into the Duke's vault, which housed a magical painting of Delilah's creation. Once stolen, we'd return to the whale and use it to head into the void, where we'd battle with a monstrous golem before finally returning Delilah to mortality. Now sadly, there's no developer testimony explaining why exactly this was cut, but in the finished version, the social deduction and dramatic boss fight have been removed in favour of something much more straightforward. We have to infiltrate the palace, locate Delilah's soul inside of the vault, and take out the Duke. No puzzles or parties or gimmicks, just you, your powers, and a very large mansion. Given one of my biggest complaints has been the lack of variety in our objectives, that might sound like a rather disappointing way to end our time in Karnaca, but actually there is more to this level than initially meets the eye. You see, when we arrive at the Palace District, Megan tells us that our work is going to be slightly complicated thanks to the Duke's body double, a man who looks, sounds and acts exactly like him, and has been employed precisely to throw off any would-be assassins. This adds an interesting dynamic to the level, as we're not just trying to work out where our target is and how to deal with them, but which Luca Abel is the correct one. Now, the process of uncovering the real Duke is made all the more engaging thanks to a massive amount of variables that makes the level play out differently every time you approach it. You see, the locations of the two men are randomised between 5 different areas: the private garden, the Duke's chambers, his offices, the throne room, and Delilah's studio. And this means that there are 20 different possible configurations. Not only does this force the player to explore the vastness of the palace and interact with all manner of smaller details, like clockwork soldiers patrolling the upper floors or guests beating servants out in the courtyard, but it also manages to maintain the body double mystery on subsequent playthroughs. One time you'll overhear the kitchen staff talking about where meals need to be delivered. Another time you'll learn that the double smokes while the Duke does not. And in a third, you might run straight into your target while climbing over the roof and have to use the mechanical heart to deduce their identity. It's just a really cool idea that's made all the more engaging by the aesthetics of the palace, which stand in stark contrast to the boarded up apartment blocks and sandblasted slums that characterise the rest of Karnaca. All throughout the game we're told about the corruption of Luca Abel's regime, and here we finally get to see where the money is being spent. And it's this atmosphere of wealth and excess, which is also built up by the palace being full of drunken soldiers, witches and noblemen, that makes the feeling of robbing the Duke blind all the more satisfying. On paper, it's got all the makings of another excellent Dishonored level, but unfortunately, as with many things in this contradictory sequel, all these clever ideas come packaged with a few issues that can be hard to ignore. The first is that the body double concept isn't really properly fleshed out, and while it's used in a creative way during the non-lethal solution, it's strangely absent when we're playing in high chaos. If you're intending to spare the Duke's life, you can approach the double and propose that he takes over from the real Luca Abel, assuming his identity and ruling with the blessing of the crown. In order to do this, we've got to kidnap Luca so the double can take a medallion that confirms his identity, and this enables him to order the real Duke's arrest, framing him as the double who has lost his mind and has taken his role too far. Considering that we consistently see Luca Abel attempting to be something he is not, A fearless leader, a talented painter, and a genius conspirator, it's satisfying to see this fakery become his undoing, but oddly, there is almost none of this depth present in the lethal solution. For some reason, if you kill the body double by mistake, the level doesn't change or react, which seems odd considering the whole purpose of the scheme is to avoid assassination attempts. There needed to be some sort of system whereby the double is being checked on, and in the case of his death, an alarm is raised, causing the Duke to go into hiding, similar to how the Lord Regent reacted to Corvo's assault on Dunwall Tower. It's possible that this wasn't included as it would make it too easy to identify the fake, but it creates a strange disconnect where eliminating the Duke doesn't really feel as climactic as the story is presenting it to be. This is the man who orchestrated the collapse of the Caldwin dynasty, who caused our father or daughter to be cast in stone, who brought mechanical monsters to slaughter the people of Dunwall, and to see him merely taken away by guards as we hide in a corner, or killed without any way to confront his crimes, well, it's pretty anticlimactic. Now thankfully our second objective, breaking into the palace vaults and destroying Delilah's phylactery, that carries with it a much more poignant payoff, one that lasts all the way to the credits. During our last visit to the Void, the Outsider tells us that in order to make our nemesis mortal, we'll need to restore her soul to her body using the mechanical heart, but as it can only hold one spirit, we'll have to shed the essence that is already inside, the one belonging to Jessamine Caldwin. This leads to what might be the best scene in all of the Dishonored series, where Emily has to give up the last memory of her mother in order to restore her legacy, or equally, a horrible moment where Corvo relives losing the woman he loves. Everything from the voice acting to the writing to the direction is absolutely perfect, and seeing Jessamine fade away, framed against the demonic image of her half-sister, reaching out one last time and whispering that she can still see your heart, well, it is utterly tragic. It's a real reminder of the series' central theme, not revenge or justice or the divine right to rule, but loss, that of a mother, a lover, a sister and an empress, a shadow that looms over all of the death and warfare that emerged in Jessamine's absence. As if that wasn't enough heartache, neither Corvo or Emily are allowed closure on this great sacrifice, as with Jessamine gone, the heart draws in the corrupting essence of Delilah and begins to grow sickly and black. From this moment on, the calm and insightful voice of the last Empress is gone, and whenever we take out the heart to check on our mission or examine an NPC, we're greeted by the cold arrogance of Delilah Caldwin. To some players, this might just be a change of voice actor when looking for a bone charm, a tiny detail in a symphony of video game complexity, but I love it as a way to use a small gameplay mechanic and turn it into a powerful narrative reminder of just what our journey has cost. It all means that as we finally leave Karnaca behind us and return to where everything began, our final confrontation with Delilah feels as if it's become about so much more than who sits upon the throne. But my friends, this brings us onto Dishonored 2's greatest crime, its final hour, where the game's building wave of narrative and storytelling issues finally crash on the shore. Now you might have noticed that we've not really spoken about Dishonored 2's chaos system, and that's because while Arkane had made some pretty big changes to its design, the overall impact on the experience is rather small. In Dishonored 1, the world state is calculated by a pretty simple system. If you kill all your assassination targets, indiscriminately slay lower level combatants, and murder even a small amount of innocent NPCs, you'll build up your chaos rating, and this will shift Dunwall from low chaos into high chaos. Here there's far more violence on the streets, the plague spreads much faster, and your allies treat you with hostility, eventually culminating in a supremely dark version of the final level, where almost everyone dies and the Empire crumbles into ruin. By contrast, if you keep your rating low, by choosing non-lethal solutions and sparing the lives of the little people, you'll see a much more optimistic version of the story that ends with the sun shining, Emily assuming the throne, and Dunwall being pulled back from the brink. While the chaos system actually gave you a lot of space to get violent without switching the world state, it was often criticised for pushing players towards binary good and bad endings, and Harvey Smith wanted to make sure that the sequel didn't repeat this supposed mistake. So in Dishonored 2, the chaos system was entirely reworked to have much more depth, and now each individual NPC has two variable characteristics that govern how much chaos they generate when they're killed. The first metric is pretty simple. Are they armed or are they unarmed? A distinction which basically separates the game's combatants from non-combatants, and treats the murder of those who can't defend themselves much more seriously. The second is a little more complicated, as every character now has one of 3 morality ratings: sympathetic, guilty, and murderous, which you can work out not only from how they act, but by scanning them with the heart, which will give you some insight into the kind of person they are. You might scan a guard standing watch in the street only to discover that they're saving money for their sister's sickly child, or look inside the soul of an innocent looking servant girl and find they love poisoning the local street cats. It's a much more realistic take on morality, where someone's role in society doesn't dictate their inherent goodness, and makes playing in low chaos much more interesting. We have to question if sparing someone's life is always the right choice. In this respect, the changes are a huge improvement, adding gameplay depth to something that you might otherwise only think about in the context of seeing both endings. But there are also downsides. The biggest is that in trying to move away from a more binary chaos system, the effects of our decisions aren't quite as obvious, and as we progress through the game, the differences between high chaos Karnaka and low chaos Karnaka can often be quite hard to spot. Now, in the first game, this meant dangerous packs of rats which could chew through your health, additional weepers wandering the streets which made it harder to stay in stealth, and 2 entire levels that played out very differently. By comparison, Karnaka doesn't really have any of this in high chaos. And while there are lots of bloodfly nests that pop up as you hunt down the Duke, they're pretty easy to deal with, and there are even bone charms that can make killing them restore your health and mana, making them something you'll actively seek out. On top of this, the Nest Keepers, people suffering with an extreme form of bloodfly fever, which makes them care for the hives and are supposed to be the sequel's version of Weepers, are actually quite rare, and don't really require any sort of unique strategy to deal with when you do encounter them. It leaves you waiting for a large level that's going to shift in response to your decisions, but strangely this never arrives, and it leaves what was previously a major part of Dishonored's identity feeling like it's been reduced into the background. Really, the only place where we see a distinct shift is in the disposition of our main character, whose voice lines will become increasingly more brutal depending on how high we push the chaos rating. In many ways, this is quite a satisfying process, and seeing Emily transform from a naive young girl into a brutal tyrant, or Corvo battle with the temptation to give in to violence, is a clever way to give the player an active role in their character development. The problem is that the vast majority of their self-reflection happens in the inter-level animated cutscenes, which don't change in accordance to your chaos rating, and thanks to their wistful and soul-searching tone, it gives the wider narrative more of a low chaos atmosphere. And once again, this detracts from the impact of the chaos system. That all being said, there is one sequence that depends entirely upon the state of the world, a conversation that happens aboard the deck of the Dreadful Whale when we return to Dunwall. Here we can speak with Megan one last time, and in high chaos, both Emily and Corvo will tell her that we're taking the skiff and going after Delilah alone. The ship captain respects our wishes, tells us not to hesitate when the moment comes, and with that, we go our separate ways. In low chaos, however, this moment plays out very differently, as Megan tells us that she's glad to have one last chance to speak, and that there is something that she needs to get off of her chest. She tells us that Megan Foster is not actually her real name, and that 15 years ago, she ran with a crew of assassins who did something terrible at the top of Dunwall Tower. Amazingly, we are standing before Billy Lurk, Dowd's rebellious second-in-command from the Knife of Dunwall, and the game offers a choice in how we want to deal with this, calling her a monster and delivering long-overdue vengeance, or recognising the regret in her heart and offering forgiveness. It's an odd reward for playing in low chaos, considering it will only mean something if you've played through the Knife of Dunwall. What's even more peculiar is that we can still make this discovery in high chaos by pickpocketing Megan and breaking into her private quarters, where we can discover her secret identity through her diary and hear a recording of Dowd talking about his crusade to protect Emily from Delilah. Not only does neither Corvo or Emily have any voice lines reacting to this discovery, but it doesn't even make sense for Billy to have this recording, as Dowd would have made it long after she left the Whalers, and we know that he's not been seen since. The whole thing just feels really clumsily thrown together in order to have some sort of late game reveal, And compared to the betrayal of the Loyalists or the revelation that Burrows caused the plague, it doesn't redefine our understanding of the story on subsequent playthroughs or even change our relationship with Megan. Now, what makes this all the more disappointing is that it's the only way our chaos rating impacts the final level, as everything else in Dunwall plays out in exactly the same way regardless of what you've done in Karnaca. Once we step back into the city and make our way towards the tower, we immediately see the devastation wrought by Delilah's short reign. Citizens hang from gallows, dead guards lay rotting in the streets, and the once grand central promenade is collapsing into ruin, with all resistance being brutally put down by a mixture of Sarkonan Clockwork soldiers and demonic black magic. In fact, in the gatehouse of the tower, we can see that the Abbey attempted to launch a coup against this heretical empress, and littered around the grounds are the petrified bodies of those who failed to depose her. The once glorious seat of power in the Empire has been carved up and drained of all life. And I think that is a real shame. As we've already discussed, Delilah was always going to be a controversial pick for Dishonored 2's villain for all sorts of reasons. But one thing that I do think Arkane nailed was the idea that both Jessamine's sister and her daughter have equally valid claims. They both have only one royal parent, both assumed the throne by force, and in the context of Emily's lack of care for her subjects and disinterest in ruling, it's hard to imagine Delilah's cold and determined personality would be any worse for the Empire. It's a mirror that is constantly turned on us during our time in Karnaca, where we see that normal people don't really care about who is on the throne, as their day-to-day lives are consumed by simply trying to stay alive. Sadly, this final level utterly destroys that conceit, as we see firsthand that Delilah's rule means nothing more than the citizenry being massacred for the enjoyment of her coven and the complete and utter ruin of the Empire of the Isles. In fact, it goes to an even more cartoonishly evil end than this, as when we finally use the heart to restore Delilah's soul and confront our nemesis in the throne room, we discover that her true plan is to use a magical painting and turn everyone in the world into statues, frozen in worship at the feet of their new empress. Turns out that Delilah isn't a dark mirror of Emily or Jessamine, but just a bog-standard, inarguably bad villain, who seems totally out of place in the grey morality of Dishonored's world. This is a series that asks you to forgive the assassin who murdered your lover, to look past the smiles of the loyalists and foil their betrayal, and to even accept a deal with the devil in order to do good in the world. And to have this game come to an end with such a clear divide between the player on the side of good and Delilah on the side of evil seems to undermine everything that Dishonored 2 has been trying to say. Now, what makes this smart all the more is that it comes packaged up in yet another sequence of reused ideas. Once inside the tower, we're exploring the exact same map that we did during Dishonored 1, with the only real difference being that certain areas have been blocked off and we're sneaking around witches and clockwork soldiers rather than the forces of the Lord Regent. Along with this, the final confrontation in Delilah's magical painted world is almost identical to how Dowd battled her in The Witches of Brigmore, although somehow it's now been structured in a much less interesting way. The goal is to work out which of the worshipping statues houses the real Delilah, and if you're playing in high chaos, you simply spring into action and start cutting them down. Now, if you want to do this non-lethally, you'll need to discover that the ritual involves a set of corrupted runes attached to the throne, which we can disturb after forging our own, another indication that bone charm crafting was originally meant to be a much larger focus in the game. Anyway, once that's done, you have to knock out the real Delilah and place her in the trap, but you'll quickly realise that none of the statues surrounding the throne are the aunt we're looking for. That is because the true Delilah is hiding up above the portal, and is only accessible via a hidden pathway. A weird decision that means this whole puzzle isn't about logical thinking or gameplay execution, but simply noticing a slightly obscured set of ledges. Compared to Dowd swapping out the paintings and watching as Delilah traps herself in the void, it is nowhere near as satisfying, and caps off what is quite a disappointingly unambitious finale. So with Delilah either slain at the end of our blade or banished for good into our own fantasy world, we step back into the throne room and see one final consequence of our actions in Karnaca. If we're in low chaos, we free our petrified father or daughter from their prison and watch as the world begins to heal. First with Dunwall being repaired under the rule of Emily Caldwin the Just, and then in Karnaca as the new Duke rebuilds the city's reputation, either with the support of Paolo or Overseer Byrne. In high chaos, things play out in a rather more sinister manner, as we're given the option to leave the other in stone, either placing a new tyrannical Coldwin on the throne or transforming the royal protector into Emperor Corvo the Black. Beyond this, we can also see what happens to Sokolov, who either heads off into the north to retire or returns to Dunwall, and the fate of Billy Lurk, who sets out to find Dowd, but there isn't really much else to act as a reward for all our efforts. We don't see what became of Kirin Jindosh, we don't see Aramis Stilton and the people of the Dust District, we don't see Hypatia repairing the Admire Institute, and really it feels like a poor reward for almost 30 hours of complex decision making. It hurts me to say this, but Dishonored 2 really doesn't tell a good story, and Arkane's attempts to try and be more direct with their narrative have only resulted in lessening all the great things they achieved in the first game. Sure, Dishonored 1 was a straight revenge story, with a somewhat obvious twist in the third act, but it used that as a platform to let us explore a truly unique world. A bizarre mixture of steampunk dystopia, Victorian politics, and Lovecraftian horror that added so much flavour to the immersive gameplay. By contrast, Dishonored 2 is packed full of interesting new gameplay ideas, sumptuous art design, a level of replayability that is rarely seen in AAA titles, and two of the greatest levels ever produced in video game history. But that cohesion between storytelling, immersion and gameplay that made the original so compelling, well, it's just not there. Ultimately, it is still an experience that I would recommend to everyone that is remotely interested in ambitious first-person video games, but it's also one that I could complain about for hours. A swirling contradiction of soaring ambition, missed potential, breathtaking creativity, and baffling mistakes. Truly a beautiful, chaotic mess of a video game, and everything I love about Arkane Studios. If we cast our mind back to the start of this video, we began by talking about Harvey Smith and how his career had been haunted by the spectre of Deus Ex Invisible War, a high-profile sequel that hadn't quite lived up to its predecessor's lofty legacy. Now, given how we've just deconstructed Dishonored 2 and explored not only the things that make it so special, but those myriad ideas that don't quite work, it might be easy to jump to conclusions and assume that this terrible curse had struck again. But that isn't really an accurate read on what happened when Dishonored 2 hit shelves in November of 2016, as, for all my complaints and criticisms, it reviewed extremely well. High-profile outlets like PC Gamer and IGN awarded Arkane Lyon's efforts a lofty 9 out of 10, while an assortment of positive reviews from organisations like Eurogamer, GameSpot, Polygon and Easy Allies all resulted in a supremely impressive Metacritic score of 88 out of 100. In fact, this would actually be even higher if not for a single inexplicably harsh 5 out of 10 review that dragged the overall average down. The reality was that Dishonored 2 was an absolute critical darling, and even managed to scoop up a prize at the 2016 Game Awards, where Rafael Colantonio and Sebastian Mitton took to the stage and accepted the Best Action Adventure award, beating out the likes of Ratchet & Clank, Hitman, and even Uncharted 4. So you'd imagine that Arkane and Bethesda would be pretty happy with their strange immersive sim sequel, but alas, happy critics do not always mean happy players. You see, Dishonored 2 has one final problem that we need to discuss. A brutal issue that proved to be lethal for its commercial ambitions and far outweighed any of the artistic or design miscalculations that we've explored in this critique. Despite all the talk of the benefits of the new Void engine, the launch version of Dishonored 2 on PC was nowhere near polished enough, and as quickly as websites and magazines were publishing their glowing reviews, they were following them up with reports of an almighty mess. Karnaka's wide suburban areas ran at sub 30 FPS. Levels were riddled with UI errors and textures that would refuse to load. The game's VSync didn't function properly. Mouse sensitivity was tied to your monitor's refresh rate. You couldn't turn off motion blur. And worst of all, the game would constantly crash thanks to it messing with CPU task priority. Even on higher end machines, Dishonored 2 was a pretty miserable experience, and for anyone without the latest gear, it was essentially unplayable. Now, this might not sound that unusual, considering the industry has long since normalised releasing broken games and fixing them post-launch, but this was still a fairly new thing in 2016, and as word spread that the game barely worked, there was minimal faith that Arkane would ever get it fixed. On top of this, that same year, Bethesda had made the unpopular decision to only send out review copies one day before release, and this helped create the sense that consumers were being ripped off, and that the publisher didn't care that the game had shipped in such a poor state. As Dishonored 1's primary market had been on the PC, this created a brutal situation, where players were demanding refunds rather than discussing the game's inventive content, and it massively depressed any sales that might have come from all that critical acclaim. Now, unfortunately for Arkane, this couldn't have happened at a worse time, as 2016 delivered an almost unending chain of high-quality games that meant that Dishonored 2 quickly slipped out of the limelight. That year had seen the release of Uncharted 4, Persona 5, Dark Souls 3, Final Fantasy 15, the Doom and Hitman reboots, XCOM 2 and Civilization 6, just to name a handful, and it meant there was almost no reason for consumers to buy a game that might not work when they had so many other options available. To make matters even worse, live service games had also begun to take over the industry. Now players were devoting huge amounts of time to games like League of Legends, Dota 2, Destiny and Rocket League. This ridiculous level of competition means it's quite easy to assume that even if Arkane's sequel had shipped in a functional state, it would have still had a very tough time. And this seems to be backed up by the twin fates of Titanfall 2 and Deus Ex Mankind Divided, two similarly complex first-person experiences that also came out in 2016 and also underperformed. So regardless of why exactly it was happening, the launch was a disaster, and after a few weeks on the market, reports began to emerge Dishonored 2's sales were almost 40% down on that of its predecessor. Now, Arkane were eventually able to get its PC performance into a good place thanks to a series of patches, but the damage had already been done, and even a campaign where Bethesda offered the first 3 levels for free, almost a third of the entire game, couldn't convince consumers to part with their cash. By mid-2017, the game was being steeply discounted, and while it looks like this might have been able to claw back some sales, with various outlets reporting that Dishonored 2 did eventually reach the 2 million mark, this was nowhere near enough for Bethesda to recoup their costs. Thanks to the expansion of Arkane into 2 unique studios, the creation of a new game engine, and all those experimental and costly design techniques, Dishonored 2 ended up costing substantially more than Skyrim, and would have needed to sell a monstrous amount of full-price copies to break even. This dire situation meant that there was a real fear that Bethesda might force Arkane into creating something more commercially viable, and finally put an end to the art above all else philosophy that had defined the studio's existence. The only thing is, that didn't actually happen, and thanks to all those sky-high review scores, Bethesda decided to give Dishonored another chance, and offered Arkane a way to claw back some money without having to lose its unique identity. You see, just like how the first game had been structured, the plan had always been to follow up Dishonored 2 with a major piece of DLC, and even before anything was announced, fans were speculating that it would involve Dowd and Billy Lurk, given that they were the only characters left without a definitive ending. The only problem was that in order for this to be profitable, it needed to be bought by a lot of people who owned Dishonored 2, and as that number was pretty low, the decision was made to instead flesh this DLC out into another standalone game. Now, that might sound insane considering Arkane Leon had just released what was essentially a commercial flop, but the idea was that this new game could reuse much of Dishonored 2's DNA, could be created in a much shorter timeframe, and could be sold as a mid-budget title, a way to cheaply squeeze more profit from the large initial investment. Now, a smaller spin-off game might not sound ideal for a studio that was founded upon the idea of limitless creativity, but when Dishonored Death of the Outsider was revealed at Bethesda's E3 2017 panel, the pitch actually sounded quite convincing. During interviews, Harvey Smith told journalists that the decision to grow the DLC into a full game had been driven by ambition, as his team had come up with so many new ideas and had such a sprawling story to tell that it didn't make sense to gate it away as an optional add-on. In many ways, this was quite believable, as in the last few years, studios like Bethesda, CD Projekt Red, and BioWare had already broken new ground by releasing expansions that were bigger than most normal games. So, going one step further and making your DLC purchasable in its own right, well, that seemed like a good move for Arkane and a good move for consumers. Now, that didn't mean that Death of the Outsider was free of controversy, but funnily enough, this was more centred around the game's narrative. as from both Smith's interviews and the game's first trailer, it was clear that we would not be playing as Dowd. Smith's justification was that Dishonored 1 and 2 were based around a generational transition, moving from Corvo to Emily, and he wanted this to be present in their expansions. So while Dowd would still play a large part in the story, and we would find out why he'd been so absent, we would see everything through the unique perspective of Billy Lurk. While that bothered some players, especially considering her role in Dishonored 2 wasn't particularly interesting, it suited the team at Arkane perfectly, as they wanted to use this opportunity to really break from the series' established conventions. Previews showed that the void powers of the past had been discarded. There was a much bigger focus on gadgets and weapons, and a recharging mana bar that let players experiment without having to constantly hunt down elixirs. With talk of levels so large that they had their own side quests, and Smith hinting at a section of the game that excited him just as much as the Clockwork Mansion, it seemed like there was plenty of reason to be excited, and that this wasn't just Bethesda cashing in on the franchise. Now, all that being said, there was one change that was much stranger than the rest, and this involved the staff that were working behind the scenes. While most of the team was formed out of Dishonored and Arkane veterans, Harvey Smith brought in some new faces to the writing team, one of which was Hazel Monforton, a PhD student who had never worked on a game. The story of her involvement is absolutely crazy. She'd been a big fan of the Dishonored series, and in September of 2016, she put together a large tweet thread that explored the Outsider as an expression of the Greek concept of pharmakos. Essentially, it's the ritualistic practice of a city scapegoating an innocent in order to create a focus during a time of crisis, and a way to prevent internal strife by channeling their anger onto this unlucky soul. Throughout the thread, Monforton explained how the Outsider provided this to the Empire of the Isles, acting as a force for social cohesion despite his own propensity for chaos, and positing that he is just another victim of the world's endless need for someone to blame. Amazingly, this thread caught the eye of Harvey Smith, and he absolutely loved the interpretation. The two began to talk, and when it was decided that Arkane were going to produce a game that revolved around the Black-Eyed God, he invited her to join the studio as a script and lore consultant. Now, you can criticise Smith's work as a director all you like, but one thing you can never do is question his love for people that love video games, or his willingness to work with people outside of the industry in hopes of making something special. It was this passion that had put Arkane on the map back in 2012, and when people saw that same energy being directed towards Death of the Outsider, there was every reason to believe that we would be closing out the Dishonored saga with a game of real substance. Dishonored Death of the Outsider is a game that does many things right, and has many interesting ideas, but it does not start well. We open with a series of animated pictures reintroducing us to Billy Lurk, who after assisting Emily Caldwin in her quest to reclaim the throne, has become consumed with thoughts of her long-lost mentor. Why did Dowd forgive her when she betrayed him all those years ago? Why does she crave the approval of a killer? And why, when the sun goes down and she slips into her dreams, does she see images of herself without an arm or an eye? When we step into the game proper, we see that Lurk is living in a now scuttled dreadful whale, and has been reaching out to her associates in the underworld, hoping to find any possible clues as to the Knife of Dunwall's whereabouts. As we find her, she is about to embark on her last remaining lead, the Albarca Baths in Karnaka's northern Campo district, where a local gang are running a fight club, offering huge money to anyone that can beat their supernatural champion. It's not much, but it's a start, and it provides the premise for Death of the Outsider's very first level. Now by this point we are just 5 minutes into the game, but we arrive at our first issue, which is that because Death of the Outsider is a standalone game rather than a DLC, it has to begin with a fairly lengthy tutorial to accommodate any new players. This means that the mission to the bathhouse and our first hour in the game is largely spent sneaking around solitary enemies, learning to climb up obstacles, and following a lot of on-screen prompts. There are no supernatural abilities to use or alternative paths to take, and the layout of the bathhouse is extremely basic, taking place over 2 very small floors and featuring little scope for experimentation. Now, while I totally understand the need for a sequence like this, it's a bit of a shift from the purposefully non-tutorialised opening of Dishonored 2, and it means that for veterans of the series, those most likely to pick up Death of the Outsider, there's really not a lot to see or do here. The only element that provides a bit of interest is the gang we're investigating, the Eyeless, who differentiate themselves from the Empire's other street gangs through their religious devotion to the Void, and work less like a criminal organisation and more like a cult. They lure in citizens fascinated with the supernatural, adorn themselves with strange tattoos, brew drinks made from Pandician plague rats, craft bone charms to be sold on the black market, and in their fight club, pitch battles against a mysterious man with mysterious powers. Unsurprisingly, this turns out to be Dowd, and we find him strapped into a chair that suppresses his connection to the Void, which we need to deactivate in order to free him. Like everything else in this level, it's an extremely straightforward process, but the reward is actually pretty cool. When we flip the switch and turn off the power, the eyeless immediately begin to panic, and in the blink of an eye, we see Dowd flash around the room, taking out his captors in seconds. An incredible display of power where we get to see his abilities from the outside and really understand why he was so feared. This leads to a reunion 15 years in the making, but as Billy begins to stumble over her words, the Knife of Dunwall cuts her off. Dowd tells her that she doesn't need to explain anything, and that all he asks is that she help him with one final job. This is not the murder of a corrupt noble or the theft of some priceless treasure, but an assassination like none other in history. Dowd wants to kill the outsider, and once and for all put an end to the cults, to the black magic, and to his chaotic influence in the Empire of the Isles. Billy can hardly believe what she's hearing, but overwhelmed by the moment, she agrees to hear out his plan. That isn't to say that the black-eyed trickster is just going to sit back and let this happen. Back on the Whale, the outsider appears to Billy in her quarters, speaking in riddles about his mark and burning away her arm and eye. A cruel twist that returns her to how she was before Emily Caldwin saved Aramis Stilton. Thanks to this unique Void injury, it appears that Billy can now use supernatural powers. But this is where another of Death of the Outsider's issues raises its head, as this entire premise rests atop some pretty flimsy writing. When Dowd asks Billy what happened, she simply replies that the outsider said some cryptic shit and then left her like this, to which he replies, "I never knew what he was after, be careful." And that's it. We never hear another conversation about why exactly Billy was given her powers. It ends up feeling quite video gamey, like Arkane knew their protagonist needed to be given abilities but couldn't quite work out how to do this in a lore-friendly way, so simply just went ahead and did it. Similarly, we don't really get a satisfying reason for Dowd's imprisonment by the Eyeless or his failing health. In the bathhouse, when Billy asks how he ended up there, he tells her that they need to talk elsewhere. But when we finally get a moment aboard the Whale, the two jump straight into the plot to kill the outsider, and never actually address how such a powerful man was captured by such a lowly street gang. The same is true of his sickly appearance, his white hair and his physical weakness, which we're told is due to him spending too long connected to the Void. But as this didn't seem to be much of an issue for Granny Rags, and, as we saw at the end of Dishonored, Corvo lived well into his old age, this seems to be another change made without much justification. Dowd is the man who slew the Empress of the Isles, who went blade to blade with the Royal Protector, who invaded the Void and defeated Delilah single-handedly, and frankly, seeing him reduced to a feeble old man isn't exactly what people were expecting when Harvey Smith assured skeptics that he would still play a big role in the game. Now, as if this wasn't already quite a lot to swallow, Dowd's mission to kill the outsider doesn't really seem all that consistent with the character that we came to know so well in Dishonored 1 and its DLC. We're told that it comes from a desire to prevent his gifts being abused by those who would do evil. But the thing is, Dowd's entire character arc in the DLC revolves around him realising that this power can actually be used for good. The story of the Knife of Dunwall and Brigmore Witches could not make it more clear that he places the responsibility for his actions squarely on his own shoulders, and believes that through protecting Emily from the schemes of Delilah, that he can achieve a kind of redemption that balances out his life of magical bloodshed. To see Dowd now trying to claim that the Void's influence on the Empire is entirely negative feels like he's being twisted to justify the premise of this game, and it really clashes with the grey morality that underpins the rest of the series. It's a disappointing way to kick things off, especially as Rosario Dawson and Michael Madsen embody Billy and Dowd so well, giving performances that really paint a picture of two people utterly drained by their previous lives. It's a shame that all the heart and emotion of their reunion is wasted on such a strange and disconnected plot. But as we saw in Dishonored 2, Arkane Leon don't necessarily need to be weaving a hyper-engaging story. in order to deliver a quality gameplay experience. Death of the Outsider's first mission takes us to Karnaka's Upper Syria district, a sprawling section of the city full of fancy shops, sun-baked promenades, and balconies that look out over the city below. A place where the wealthy can live in comfort and don't have to concern themselves with the business of those beneath them. Our goal is to investigate the leaders of the Eyeless Gang, as Dowd believes that they have come into possession of the knife used to create the Outsider. And thanks to a slip of the tongue by his captors, we know that they all get their tattoos done at a beauty parlour called the Red Camellia. Now, once again, the writing that underpins this objective doesn't exactly make sense, as we aren't told how Dowd discovered this information, which Dishonored 2 specifically portrayed as something that had been lost after the passage of thousands of years. As it turns out, there was a cult that knew all about the Outsider's origins all along. While I didn't particularly like the demystification of the character in the last game, the idea that his genesis is common knowledge that anyone can discover is even worse. Thankfully, we can put this to the back of our mind while exploring Upper Syria, as there are a lot of interesting new gameplay concepts to sink our teeth into while Billy hunts down the Eyeless. The most obvious place to start is with her powers, as just like Arkane promised during the game's marketing, she works very differently to Dowd, Corvo and Emily. Rather than hunting down runes in order to unlock and upgrade a broad spread of powers, Billy has just 3: Displace, Semblance and Foresight, with the idea being that environments have been specifically crafted to take advantage of this moveset. In interviews, Smith described how this allowed Arkane's designers to have a better understanding of what a player might do in each given situation, and rather than creating challenges that have 6 or 7 shallow solutions, they could create detailed sequences that really pushed the 3 powers to their limits. Now, this is quite a risky mix-up to the established Dishonored formula, as it puts a lot of pressure on the designers to come up with abilities that can carry the entire game. But I think they've been broadly successful and have struck a balance between new and old. Let's start with Displace, which is effectively Billy's version of Blink, allowing you to quickly move around environments and clamber up out of sight. But it comes with a twist that asks you to be more thoughtful about its use. This is because rather than aiming the ability and then letting go, we have to first place a marker, which we then teleport to with a second press of the button. Obviously this makes it a touch more fiddly than using Blink, but as the markers persist even if you move out of range, and don't need to be exactly targeted in order to be triggered, it allows for some interesting possibilities. You can do things like leaving a marker in a safe space, ready for you to leap to after you've killed a guard, or combining it with a bone charm that adds a second charge, so you can create chains of markers that allow us to clear massive distances. Now, while that all represents a bit of a change, in practice it still means a lot of crawling around on top of bookshelves and leaping between apartment balconies, something that we've seen quite a lot of in the last 2 games. But in Semblance and Foresight, Arkane have really tried to mix things up. At first, Semblance looks somewhat similar to Corvo's possession ability, allowing Billy to take the form of an unconscious NPC, but where it differs is that we can still move and act like normal. This means you're free to take enemies out, interact with objects and set traps, with the disguise only breaking if you act completely out of character, or if your mana expires, although it doesn't drain while you're standing still. That might not sound all that dramatic, but it opens up a huge amount of social stealth situations, where we can take the form of a specific NPC and use them to access restricted areas, like a bar run exclusively for the Eyeless, a heavily guarded bank, or even the apartment of someone waiting for their lover. Considering so much of Dishonored's stealth is predicated on the same old ideas of staying out of view and skulking around in the shadows, it's really refreshing to be given another method of remaining undetected. And as you can discover bone charms that make the ability last an incredibly long time, there's so much scope for wandering around in character and creating chaos in plain sight. The third power is Foresight, which effectively replaces the dark vision and void gaze powers which we used in the last 2 games to see enemies through walls. Rather than toggling this information on and off, we now have to send out a spirit which we can use to tag enemies and objects, which then persist on screen when we revert back to playing as Billy. It's a very controversial change, as while Foresight allows you to build an extensive understanding of an area before having to physically go there, and has a cool synergy with Displace as you can place down markers while in this mode, it all dramatically slows down the moment-to-moment gameplay. If you're trying to remain out of sight while heading into an unknown space, you basically have to use the ability every few minutes, and as the base level foresight doesn't last particularly long or have much range, you'll often feel like you have to use it multiple times before you get an accurate picture of the environment. In games that effectively use tagging systems, it's usually something you do from a distant vantage point and with no time restrictions. And while I admire Arkane for trying to experiment with something different, it's hard not to miss the simplicity and speed of dark vision. On that subject, the speed of the gameplay is something else that's been tinkered with, as while all these abilities are quite slow paced, we no longer have any limits on the amount we can use them. This is because Billy doesn't have to consume elixirs in order to restore her mana, and instead we have 3 distinct segments which can be used in quick succession or spent all at once on a longer semblance or foresight. As each bar recharges pretty quickly, it encourages you to use your abilities as much as physically possible, and this helps to balance out the more methodical pace. Now, along with the big changes to our powers and how we interact with the core stealth gameplay, there have also been some pretty seismic shifts in how our progression works. With only 3 powers to use, there are no runes to discover or ability variants to unlock, and this means that everything is focused on finding bone charm modifiers out in the wild or spending money on upgrades at the black market. While the first is pretty much unchanged from the first 2 Dishonored games, its use here as the only form of supernatural progression really highlights that it is not a particularly engaging system. Finding bone charms tends to be a bit of a lottery, as you can never really be sure if they're going to be useful or not. And while Dishonored 2 allowed us to break them down and craft our own, for some strange reason that ability isn't unlocked in Death of the Outsider until the very last level. Similarly, without the mechanical heart, and with foresight having such a limited range, the game now has to put prompts on screen when you're near a charm, a system that feels like a huge step backwards from the natural process that we previously followed. In fact, this is also true of Billy's ability to speak to rats, which is clearly meant to replicate how the heart would give insight into the world around you, but is never actually explained in the story or used to any sort of real effect during the gameplay. It's just sort of there, and like the on-screen bone charm prompts, it feels like it's been thrown into the game rather than carefully crafted to work with all the other mechanics, a far cry from the crazy levels of gameplay cohesion that we're used to seeing from this series. Thankfully, the changes to the black market are much more successful, and feel like a really nice addition to the massive sprawl of Upper Syria. Much like in Dishonored 2, in order to spend any money, we need to locate a black market shop. But rather than just offering a place to buy upgrades and restock ammo, they now have a notice board where we can pick up smaller side quests called contracts. These give us a way of earning coin beyond just stealing, and they really fit with Billy's background as someone who has lots of connections to the underworld and is well known for being able to get things done. Now, understandably, the contracts are nowhere near as exciting as the main objectives, typically asking us to do things like take out a stalker who's bothering a bank teller, or stealing artwork that was supposedly painted by Duke Luca Abel. Small little challenges that are designed to keep you from rushing from cutscene to cutscene. That being said, they do sometimes have interesting little twists, like discovering that a local dentist has been kidnapped by the eyeless and is being put through a process called exsanguination. Upstairs in their bar, we can see that the nobles are paying the cult to use these abductees for blood transfusions, a process which allows them to peer into the void and a real reminder of the sickening rot that still lingers under Karnaka's respectable surface. Along with little random moments you can stumble upon, like a taxidermy shop where an owner is using the district's homeless to harvest bloodfly nectar, there's still a lot of natural world building to discover. Despite Arkane implementing something as traditional as side quests, it's done with their trademark immersive flair. The final big shift we need to discuss is the removal of the chaos system, as while it was fading into the background during Dishonored 2, it's been completely jettisoned for the spin-off. Harvey Smith's explanation was that while Corvo and Emily are high-profile individuals, whose decisions shape the very face of the Empire, Billy Lurk is just a lowly assassin, so it wouldn't exactly make sense for her actions to carry such massive consequences. On the surface, this sounds like a somewhat convenient explanation for removing yet another layer of complexity, but I actually quite like the change. Without NPC morality or world state to worry about, we're free to just enjoy the design of the levels, and react to situations or solve challenges in ways that feel natural, rather than always having to force ourselves down a lethal or non-lethal pathway. For example, early on in the level, we have to steal a key from a man called Ivan Jacobi, who's standing in a heavily guarded courtyard practicing a speech that he will be giving later that day. There are a bunch of different ways to rob him, using semblance on a guard so we can get close and pickpocket him, using displace to hack him down and then teleporting to safety, blowing the whole courtyard sky high with explosives, or even dropping him through a trap door into an abandoned basement. As none of these now carry any sort of moral judgment, it's just simply down to whichever solution you notice. And while that might sound less engaging from a role-playing perspective, it actually helps with your immersion, as you're not constantly having to save and reload in order to execute the perfect heist. Now, when taken together, you could easily make the argument that these new systems aren't really enough to justify a standalone release. But what saves Death of the Outsider from feeling like a DLC is the wonderful design of Upper Syria. Where most of Dishonored 2's suburban levels were just one or two streets and a handful of apartments, Upper Syria is a sprawling multi-tiered maze of roads and rooftops, full of NPCs milling around with unique things to say, patrolled by different factions that react differently depending on how you look, and an incredible 11 different explorable buildings, 2 of which are so large that they require an entire loading screen before you can head inside. It's about as close as Dishonored has ever come to an open world structure. And again, while purists might recoil at Arkane using more traditional design ideas, it's inarguably fun to wander the district streets and see what sort of trouble you can get into. So, while Death of the Outsider doesn't exactly put its best foot forward, by the time we're hunting down the leaders of the Eyeless and exploring a whole new section of Karnaca, we're right back to what Dishonored does best. The reality is that even when working to strict deadlines and tight budgets, nobody does immersive level design and creative first-person gameplay like Arkane Studios. And as our hunt for a blade that created a god continues, we start to see glimpses of the team at their very ambitious best. During the build-up to Death of the Outsider's release, Harvey Smith told journalists and excited fans that Arkane Lyon were working on a level which he felt was at the same standard as the Clockwork Mansion, another one of those flagship sequences that would come to define the game's legacy. We never actually found out which part of the game he was referring to, but I would bet an enormous amount of money that he was talking about the bank job, a masterclass in reactive and replayable level design that is easily the best moment in this game. So while hunting down the names of the Eyeless leaders, Billy discovers that 2 of them were in possession of a set of security keys for the Dolores Michael Deposit and Loan Bank, and as it's heavily implied that the owner, Dolores Michaels, is also an Eyeless, our protagonists deduce that this must be where the cult is keeping the blade. The only problem is that this is no normal bank, as its clientele is formed exclusively of the most wealthy individuals in Karnaca, and they even have a deposit box reserved for the Empress herself. Thanks to this, it's one of the most heavily guarded places in the entire Isles, under lockdown almost 24 hours a day, patrolled by a small army of guards, and built around a security system custom designed to fool would-be burglars. Pulling this off is going to be no small feat, but most normal thieves don't have supernatural powers, and this clash between the Empire's most secure facility and 2 of its finest assassins makes for an absolutely captivating level. Now, before we jump into the bank job's sprawling complexity, I want to take a moment to appreciate the beautiful simplicity of the level's premise. Despite being the plot of about 50 different heist movies, robbing a high security bank isn't something we see all that often in video game form, as most stealth games, including Dishonored, are typically focused on infiltration and assassination. To see Arkane Lyon try their hands at this classic setup is really a great change of pace from all the lightning strike murders that we usually find ourselves conducting, and it creates a wonderful canvas for the careful, methodical pace of Death of the Outsider. So the first step in our plan is to get inside, but as the bank is currently locked down, you'll need to choose between one of 3 different entry points: the sewers that run under the building, a waste disposal entrance, and a painter's lift that can take you up to the roof. Each one has its own little sequence that's required to unlock it, like hunting down the body of a dead bank custodian who has the key to the waste room, or getting hold of a worker's access wrench and then unlocking the sewer gates without the guards spotting you. It's nothing wildly complex, but this choice has a large impact on the rest of the mission, as the 3 routes take you to 3 different starting points, each of which dictates the order in which you discover key information about how the bank works. The biggest obstacle we have to overcome is the bank's vault, as we quickly discover that Dolores Michaels commissioned Kirin Jindosh to design something impenetrable, and in his crazed genius, he produced a large room that moves between 3 guarded locations inside of a sealed mechanical lift. It's all controlled from within a locked security room on the 2nd floor, which also houses a guard whose job it is to monitor the vault at all times. So before we can even think about getting at the blade, we have to work out how to deal with the security. This requires us to head down into the archives on the bottom floor, so we can steal the entrance codes from Officer Alexander Payner, something that is relatively straightforward if you entered via the roof, which puts you at the top of the bank's central stairwell, but is much harder when coming in via the sewers or the waste room. Not only does this route ask you to sneak through the bank teller's offices and deactivate an electrified security system before you even make it to the inner atrium, but this space is also patrolled by the last of Jindosh's Clockwork soldiers. Rather than the bird-like versions that he gave to the Duke and Delilah, these are a slightly older model, but no less lethal, and will raise the bank's alarm if they notice anything suspicious, like the wall of light protecting the stairs being turned off, or the vault moving to an unscheduled location. So once you're down in the archive and have stolen the codes from Officer Payner, you can head up to the security offices and make your way to the vault controls, but here is where the bank job throws the first of a few surprises. If you move the vault to either Michael's offices or the archives, the only 2 places where we can access its front door, the guard who's monitoring its location will suspect that there is a robbery and will raise the alarm, which sends every conscious guard and every Clockwork soldier to protect the vault. Obviously this makes retrieving the knife very hard, but there is a way to avoid it happening, although you have to put your mind into the character of Billy Lurg, someone who thrives when hiding in plain sight. On the side of the console there is a microphone that links back to the security office, and if you notice it, you can trigger a dialogue tree where you can attempt to convince the guard that this is a scheduled test, and that forgetting about it could place his job in danger. Considering so much of Dishonored involves gratifying violence and crazy supernatural action, it's really satisfying to be able to deal with this situation with just our words, and it shows that even 3 games deep, Arcade Leon was still finding new ways to twist their formula and keep things fresh. Now, even if the vault has been positioned somewhere we can get to, we still need Michael's 3rd security key, and that involves getting into her office, where we get another little surprising challenge. You see, her key is hidden away in a secret compartment, which is opened by pressing a button behind her desk, but this situation is not quite as easy to navigate as it sounds. Michaels is currently entertaining a prospective new client, and if we drop down and press the button without her noticing, she'll wander over and reclose it. But if we take her and her client out, we'll activate a Clockwork soldier that can quickly put an end to the heist. If you're too weak to take on the soldier, this presents a real conundrum, but the solution is once again laterally brilliant. If we press the button 3 times, Michaels will presume that the security system is broken, and she'll head off to find the maintenance team, leaving us free to rob the compartment or to take her out in the quiet stairwell. So with this we have the 3 keys and we have the vault where we want it, which means we can take the ritual blade and head back to Dowd. But what makes the bank job so utterly compelling is that we've barely even scratched the surface of the many ways that this robbery can play out. For example, it's possible to skip the entire sequence with the security room and get inside of the vault through sheer blunt force. On the 3rd floor above Michael's offices are the bank maintenance rooms, and in here we can grab a tool that can detach the vault from its railings, which, if we do when it's at its highest point, will send it plummeting down through the floor and into the sewers. This leaves us free to drop down after it and break in without having to worry about anyone getting in our way, and yet again shows Arkane willing to create complex pieces of gameplay that some players might completely miss. In fact, the same is true for the rest of the bank's treasure, as while we're ostensibly here just to steal the eyeless blade, there's nothing stopping us from leaving with pockets loaded full of Karnakan wealth. As we've already seen, there are 2 key places to hit, the lockboxes down in the archive and the other sealed doors inside of the vault, but opening both requires a bit of brain power. The lockboxes each require that you hunt down a note relating to the owner's name, and these reveal some sort of key detail, like the amount of money they came to Karnaca with or their birthday, which can then be converted into the safe combination. What's funny about these is that one of them belongs to Dr. Galvani, which takes the amount of times we've robbed him across the series up to a whopping 4. Now, the sealed doors in the vault are a little more complicated, as we discover in a memo from Kirin Jindosh that they will only open if the combinations on every door are set to the correct configurations, meaning that it's all or nothing. The solution lies in a journal written by a bank clerk who became obsessed with solving the puzzle. but only manage to work out that each preceding number is generated by those that came before it. It's not quite as challenging as the plaques in the Dust District, but it's still very satisfying to realise that the doors are locked by the Fibonacci sequence, and managing to rob the entire vault without anyone even noticing really delivers on the fantasy of pulling off the perfect heist. Obviously, with all these moving parts, interactive elements, and hidden alternative solutions, Arkane have done an incredible job of delivering on this concept. But what makes this level so special is that there is a totally different way to approach the entire process. You see, while Billy's take on the job was breaking in and sneaking around, Dowd had come up with a slightly different plan that involved getting hold of an anaesthetic gas called laudanum. Considering quite how heavily guarded the vault is, this is an appealing idea, but actually getting hold of the substance is quite hard. The only place where it can be found is in the Upper Syria pharmacy, but when we arrive there, we find it's been shut down and all the owner's possessions are being auctioned off at a high society event on Forella Way. Here the guards are only letting in people who look the part, so we have to hunt down a secluded noble and use semblance on them so we can attend the auction and try to bid on the pharmacy's supply of laudanum. Amazingly, this is a fully functional auction, and we need to bid against other interested parties and make sure that we have enough money to actually pay, all while trying to avoid detection and running out of mana. Despite containing absolutely zero action of any kind, it's a thrilling sequence to play through, and in many ways, it's a shame that Death of the Outsider wasn't developed with the same level of scope as Dishonored 2, where we might have gotten more of these sequences and seen Billy's social stealth potential better fleshed out. Now once we've got the laudanum, we follow the same process as before in order to get up to the roof, where we can chuck it into the vents and then head down into the bank. Inside, everyone is completely passed out, which you might think would make our objectives utterly trivial, but even this process has a unique set of challenges. You see, if you make even the slightest noise, either by knocking something over or bumping into someone or activating the vault's lift, you'll wake up anyone nearby, and this will immediately cause them to raise the alarm. As the security systems are still live and all the Clockwork soldiers remain unaffected, it's still surprisingly hard to get hold of the knife, especially as now the slightest misstep will result in the job going completely off the rails. Creeping around the offices and archives, constantly trying to work out if anyone is in earshot, or if what you're doing will trigger some unknown alarm, makes for an incredibly tense level, and it's so impressive that Arkane Leon could create two entirely different experiences with the exact same constituent parts. It shows that even when the story is headed off in a strange direction, and the gameplay has been streamlined beyond what might have felt natural, this was a studio and team overflowing with talent, a group of developers that simply couldn't help themselves but craft memorable and engaging slices of video game content. While I might not place the bank job on quite the same generational pedestal that Smith had spoken about while doing the rounds with the media, it's still far more creative, reactive and replayable than almost anything else that was released in 2017, and is far and away the best part of Death of the Outsider. Even if you're skeptical about the changes to the gameplay and the narrative decisions, this is a mission well worth experiencing. And if you've enjoyed the Dishonored series without robbing the Dolores Michael Deposit and Loan Bank, you owe it to yourself to give it a try. So after the open-ended sprawl of Upper Syria and the reactive complexity of the bank job, things are looking pretty good for Arkane Leon's spin-off. And while the opening was a little shaky, we've ended up getting a pretty good slice of what the studio does best. Unfortunately, this does not last, and as we take the ritual blade from its container and step into the finale of our quest, Death of the Outsider collapses into a storm of questionable decisions, a downward spiral that would prove to be the end of the Dishonored franchise. As we crack open the vault, the Outsider once again appears before us, claiming that his story and Billy's are not all that different, two loners ensnared by the world's darkness, left with wounds that cannot heal and destined to collide. Unsurprisingly, Billy is unmoved by these riddles, but is stopped in her tracks when the Outsider tells her that Dowd is dead. Incredibly, the knife of Dunwall passed away while we were busy on the bank job, and despite racing back to the dreadful whale, all we are left with is a brief animated cutscene where Billy burns the boat as a pyre and says goodbye for the last time. There's no real way to sugarcoat this, but the decision to kill Dowd off screen and then only acknowledge it with a few voice lines and a couple of still images is absolutely absurd. And I cannot believe that this is how Arkane Leon wanted to send off such a beloved character. Considering that virtually all of the initial fan excitement was centred around getting to see Dowd after his absence in Dishonored 2, it is very hard to understand this decision. Not only does it mean that Dowd is only on screen for a measly 5 minutes, but it removes the primary driver of the story, effectively making him a plot device that Arkane cash in to provide motivation for Billy, as she decides to continue with the mission in order to honour Dowd's memory. Now, the biggest problem here is that Billy simply isn't a compelling enough character on her own, and without our attachment to Dowd, it's easy to feel like the gameplay and narrative become even more disconnected than they already were. Outside of a few voice lines that allude to Deirdre, a childhood friend of hers, and a handful of animated stills that show her being trained by Dowd, we discover very little about Billy's life, and she can often feel like a character without any agency, doing things because other people want her to, rather than because she is driving the story forwards. Now, unfortunately, this is only made worse by the next section of the game, which rather than coming across like an important step forward in our quest, feels like it was put together in order to pad out the runtime. While inside the Dolores Michael Bank, Billy discovers that the Eyeless were dealing with a traitor, a man named Luterio Cienfuegos, who was sending cult secrets to Brianna Ashworth while she was still alive. One of the documents was a map to the Eyeless Sanctuary, a base hidden away in an abandoned quarry on Mount Shindere, which supposedly houses a fracture in reality that allows the most dedicated members of the cult to explore the inner workings of the Void. Obviously, this is where Billy needs to go if she wants to strike at the Outsider, but before we can head there, we need to get hold of the map, which means a little detour to a very familiar location, the Royal Conservatory in Syria Gardens. I think this is the moment that Death of the Outsider loses that true standalone game or expensive DLC argument, as reusing an entire level from the last game is not something you'd expect to see from even a mid-budget title. Now, the justification for this is that the atmosphere and gameplay are slightly different, as Billy's trip to the conservatory takes place during the day and sees its halls patrolled by the overseers of the Abbey, who are clearing out the last remnants of Ashworth's occupation. Beyond this, we also finally get to see the Sisters of the Oracular Order, but disappointingly they function exactly like the Overseers and don't present any sort of unique gameplay challenge, as the world building portrays them as a mystical sect whose proclamations can dictate if an empress has legitimacy or not. Discovering that they are nothing more than regular enemies is very underwhelming, and it means that yet again, the Royal Conservatory doesn't feel entirely fresh. Now, thankfully, it's not all bad, and while the wider process of exploring the level isn't particularly interesting, actually getting hold of the map requires us to unpick a really cleverly designed sequence. Up in Ashworth's old office, we can find Vice Overseer Alvaro Cardoza, and if we time our arrival just right, we can overhear a messenger asking him to meet with Sister Roswin in the conservatory gardens, as she's made a discovery that could threaten the very existence of the Abbey. Billy deduces that this must be Cienfuegos' map, as anything that could lead people into the Void itself would be considered the highest of heresies. Now, of course, in true Dishonored fashion, you're free to go in guns blazing and simply take the map by force, but there are far more elegant solutions available for those versions of Billy that are looking to avoid bloodshed. You see, it's perfectly possible to knock out the Vice Overseer and then use Semblance to attend the meeting in his place, or trick your way into the gardens by assuming the appearance of one of the sisters. This gives you the option of either pickpocketing Roswin or following Cardoza back down into the conservatory, where he checks the map on a projector and saves Billy the effort of needing to decode the map herself. It is as reactive as it is rewarding, once again highlighting that there was real potential in the social stealth moveset that Arkane have designed, but sadly it's also a pretty short section of the level, and without any runes to hunt down, the chaos system to add variety, or any other powers to create alternative solutions, our trip to the Royal Conservatory ends up being rather brief. Really, this brings me back to the question of Death of the Outsider's status as a standalone game, because even if you're clearing all the contracts and taking your time with the objectives, you can reach the game's final level, the Eyeless base on Shindere Peak, in just 5 or so hours. By comparison, this would only take you to around the end of the Clockwork Mansion in Dishonored 2, and while Arkane had always advertised this as a smaller experience, the reality is that it is dramatically smaller than most people expected. Now, there is nothing wrong with short games, and in fact, many of the greatest releases of all time are held in such high acclaim precisely because they prioritise tight pacing over endless repetitive content. If a game is all killer no filler, then it's very hard to have any complaints, but I think that Death of the Outsider struggles to justify itself as a standalone release, and its short runtime and reused environments really stand out. This all means that there is a lot riding on the ending, that confrontation with the outsider that players have been waiting to see since the title was revealed, and the difference maker between a satisfying experience and a disappointing cash-in. This final chapter, A Hole in the World, begins on the outskirts of Shinderay Peak, as Billy wakes to yet another visitation, but this time the conversation has a slightly different tone. The outsider claims that inside this mountain lies the secret of his ascension, a process that not only took his life, but his name. Part of himself that was lost when the mob strapped him to the sacrificial table. In this moment, the riddles bleed away, and he leaves us with what sounds like a plea for mercy, knowing that Billy wants to fulfill Dowd's dying wish, but gently reminding her that there is always a choice. So with that, we begin our assault on the eyeless headquarters, which in a welcome shift returns to the linear construction of the Coldwind Bridge and flooded district from Dishonored 1, giving us a sequence of environments that we move through as we work out how to enter the void. Now, I've always felt like these sections really work with Arkane's unique style of design, asking us to get from point A to point B, but giving us a ton of different ways to do so. And it's particularly well suited to the atmosphere of the eyeless headquarters, which slowly builds its mystery as we progress through the level. At first, we're moving through the ruins of the old quarry, leaping between collapsing roofs and operating rusted machinery, all while sneaking around cult members that are strangely well dressed and are locked in debate about science and philosophy. As we make our way up and into the mountain, the crumbling buildings give way to huge clefts in the rock, vast crevices that house sleeping quarters, mess halls, steel infrastructure, and well-spoken gentlemen giving speeches to their compatriots. Clearly there is more to the eyeless than the magic-obsessed street thugs that we saw at Albarca Baths, and as we push further into their den and discover a monstrous library full of scholars debating the nature of the void and the creatures that dwell within it, the puzzle at the heart of Death of the Outsider finally unravels. The eyeless didn't uncover the truth about the origins of the outsider. They are the descendants of the cult that created him. In the depths of Shinderay Peak, their headquarters serves a dual purpose, as both a research base where the best and brightest of the Empire are invited to join them, but also as a prison where the status quo is maintained, channeling the dangerous and wild energy of the void into a singular being, the outsider. While it might be somewhat unrealistic for the cult to still be in operation after 4,000 years, it's undeniably a pretty cool idea. It does a great job of taking Hazel Monforton's ideas of pharmakos, that ancient Greek concept of sacrificing an innocent to save the city, and converting it into a form that works within the Dishonored mythos. Rather than a chaotic trickster preying upon the strong and weak alike, Death of the Outsider reimagines the black-eyed god as an unwilling martyr, a man cast into madness and pain in order to protect the rest of humanity, hated and cursed for the blessings he gives, despite being the lesser of two evils. It's a fascinating take on the character, but while it makes for a great piece of world building, it doesn't necessarily convert into engaging gameplay. The first issue is that this whole sequence is very short, and you can make your way from the quarry up to the inner sanctum in just a few minutes. Admittedly, this is also true of the flooded district and Coldwind Bridge, but where A Hole in the World really struggles is that it also needs to deliver the game's climax, and simply moving us along a linear pathway isn't all that exciting. So things need to go up a notch, and this happens when Billy discovers the Eye of a Dead God, a strange blackened artifact laying half buried in the rock, which is the portal that the cult are using to enter the void. This takes us to the Ritual Hold, a visually incredible section of the game that finally allows us to wander freely inside of Dishonored's chaotic dimension, and gives us time to take in the endless horizons and surrealist architecture. As our goal is hunting down the hiding place of the outsider, it's a tantalising prospect, until you realise that this sequence is the exact same journey that we've just done, but in reverse, with no new areas or secrets and exactly the same short runtime. Considering how amazing it looks, it's pretty disappointing that Arkane couldn't come up with a more engaging way to use the void. And while we do have to sneak around a new type of enemy, the Devoid, cultists who have spent too long away from reality. They are clearly just reskinned Clockwork soldiers. What makes this even worse is that when we do reach the bottom of the mountain and stand before the outsider, this story that concerns itself with the death of a god 4 millennia in the making resolves with a real whimper. As we step towards his frozen body, Billy realises that Dowd's spirit has made its way into the hold, and while he is distant and confused, much like Jessamine was during Dishonored 2, he can bring himself together just enough to encourage Billy to use the knife, despite her beginning to doubt that killing the outsider is actually the right thing. Just like during the game's opening, I still don't think this dynamic works, and if anything, Billy and Dowd's roles would make far more sense if they'd been reversed, casting the old man as the voice of caution and mercy after everything he's been through, and Billy as the bitter sword of vengeance, desperate to make sure that there can never be another Delilah Caldwin. Regardless, it is Billy that stands with the knife in her hand, but before we can plunge it into the outsider's chest, we are presented with a choice. You see, even without the chaos system pushing us into two binary outcomes, Arkane has framed the final moments of Death of the Outsider as a moral question. Does the outsider deserve to die for the things he has done, or is he an ancient scapegoat that should finally be freed? Personally, I think it's a strange way to frame the situation, as it ignores a perfectly valid third option, which is that Billy might agree with the cult, and think that an untamed void unleashing its energy without any direction is a price too high to pay for one man's soul. Unfortunately, the moral dilemma does not go that deep, and instead it feels far more like lethal and non-lethal options, especially with how they're presented in the gameplay. If we want to use the knife and fulfill Dowd's wishes, we simply choose death and watch the ending play out. But if we want to set the outsider free, it requires a few additional steps that take place before we arrive here. What's disappointing is that, unlike almost every other alternative solution in the series, which generally requires exploring the environment and engaging with some unique mechanic, a hole in the wall basically serves this up on a platter. Once inside the void, one of the first things we see is the body of Malachi, an eyeless scholar who had devoted his life to translating the language of the dead, and in his room we can find that he had worked out that the mark of the outsider is actually the being's original name. Now, Billy can't speak or read the language, but once we meet with Dowd's spirit, we can convince him to abandon his crusade and instead whisper the lost name in the outsider's ear, which reverses the ritual and returns him to life as a human. In my opinion, neither of these options feel all that gratifying, largely because killing the outsider is built upon weak motivations that don't seem to line up with the rest of the series, and sparing him only becomes an option in the final 15 minutes. Which is nowhere near enough time for the player to really debate which choice might be right. As if that didn't damage the drama of the moment enough, we also don't even see the consequences of this decision, as all we are rewarded with is a few still images, where Billy briefly muses about her adventure and then we're thrust straight into the credits. We don't see what the world is like without the outsider's influence, or how the void works now that it's been unshackled, or even something as basic as what Billy's life looks like without Dowd. And frankly, it doesn't remotely deliver on the emotion and atmosphere that Arkane were building up to. Much like the rest of the game, A Hole in the World is a level that you can have plenty of fun messing around in, and it's still a beautiful visual experience, but it's just wrapped around a narrative that doesn't live up to its potential. The cruel reality is that much like its namesake, Death of the Outsider is caught between two worlds. It's obviously far more complex and ambitious than a traditional piece of DLC, and does have a ton of interesting ideas that mix up the series formula, but it's also not really a proper standalone game, and constantly feels like it's delivering an experience that needed more flesh on the bone. In another world somewhere, Death of the Outsider exists as a $15 expansion, trimmed down to its very best ideas, or as a sprawling third entry, with its narrative and gameplay potential fully realised. Alas, we live in the reality where neither of these things happened, and for Arkane Leon and Dishonored, a franchise and studio responsible for some of the finest video game design ever conceived, this future without the outsider began to look incredibly uncertain. When Death of the Outsider released in September of 2017, it initially looked as if Bethesda and Arkane's spin-off gamble might just have paid off. Its review scores were pretty positive, generally coming in at around an 8 out of 10, Thanks to another year with the Void engine, the game launched in a pretty stable state, and didn't have anything like the technical issues that blighted its predecessor. With its affordable price tag and a launch window without much AAA competition, the stage was set for Arkane Lyon's big comeback. But as the weeks ticked by, there was a conspicuous lack of good news. Now, Bethesda has never been open about Death of the Outsider's sales numbers, but from what little information we do have, it's pretty obvious that it performed even worse than Dishonored 2. The sole source we have for sales estimates that in its first week, the game shipped less than 50,000 units on both the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, and as its all-time peak numbers on Steam are just north of 6,000 players, this can't have been much better on PC. Whether because of confusion around its semi-DLC status, the unpopularity of Billy as a character, or its notoriously short length, Death of the Outsider simply didn't connect with existing fans or convert any new ones, and after just a few months, it was clear that Arkane Lyon had produced yet another commercial disappointment. Now, the soul-saving grace was that as the game was relatively cheap to produce, the studio wasn't at risk of being closed down, but there were still serious consequences, as Bethesda wanted to see big changes moving forwards. In 2023, Raphael Colantonio told Rock Paper Shotgun that in the aftermath of Death of the Outsider's release, Arkane were told that their parent company wasn't interested in a potential Dishonored 3, and instead wanted the studio to produce something small-scale that could include multiplayer gameplay and microtransactions. Now, that might sound like a horrible fate for the team that produced the Clockwork Mansion and a crack in the Slab, but as with everything else in Arkane's history, their ambition soon took over, and these cynical ideas transformed into an extremely interesting video game. But that is a story for another day. So now that we've walked the streets of Karnaca and recounted the death of the Dishonored series, all that remains is for us to assess its legacy. And to do that, I want to take you back to an interview that Harvey Smith gave Game Informer during the run-up to Dishonored 2's release. Near the end of the session, he was asked what impact he hoped the game would have on the industry, and after taking a moment to collect his thoughts, he gave an answer that is nothing short of heartbreaking. He began by saying that his main hope was that the game did well for the sake of his colleagues, as he knew from both Deus Ex and Dishonored 1 how emotionally powerful it was to have one of your games really capture people's imagination. As for the wider industry, his answer was that he hoped Dishonored 2 would prove people's assumptions about success were wrong, that you didn't have to dumb down your ambitions in order to be profitable, and that there was a market out there for games based on high-quality art, immersive world-building, and creative design. Given everything we know about what happened post-launch, it's an utterly haunting exchange to watch. Smith had been desperate to avoid repeating the mistakes made during Deus Ex Invisible War, carefully positioning Dishonored's sequel so that it would still appeal to fans of the original while letting his team loose on visionary levels that have gone down in video game history. And yet, none of it had worked. His friends and colleagues didn't get that moment of satisfaction knowing that millions of people had connected with their work, and the industry ploughed on undisturbed, hurtling towards an era of sanitary design, hollow live service, and shameless monetization. It's deeply depressing, but there is also hope hidden in the tragedy. Earlier in the video, I said that not everything worthwhile has to be immaculate. A reminder that even for all of Dishonored 2's strange narrative missteps and awkward pacing issues, it's still an extremely engaging video game that deserves to be remembered for its soaring highs, rather than torn down for its lows. This is also absolutely true when it comes to discussions of legacy, as a game doesn't need to sell millions of copies or spawn endless sequels to have made a mark on history. The reality is that Smith's hopes for his team absolutely did come true. And while Dishonored 2 might not have broken sales records, Arkane Lyon undoubtedly created an experience that has stood the test of time. You can load it up today and still find little details that you'd never previously noticed. Stumble across a solution or interaction that you had no idea was possible. Still marvel at the attention to detail that makes its world so believable. And the genius behind its best moments, well, that never gets old. To have crafted a video game that still demands to be dissected, critiqued and eulogized like Dishonored 2 does, even almost a decade later, well, that is more than most developers ever get to achieve. So while we began with the words of Emily Caldwin, let's end with those of the Nameless outsider, a final prayer originally spoken to Daud the Assassin, but one that is more than fitting to see off Dishonored and its creators. All things end. All things burn to ash. But you, my friends, you burn bright. Thanks for watching. Before I sign off completely, I'd like to dedicate this video to the memory of Daniel Licht, Dishonored's composer, who suddenly passed away in 2017 just before the release of Death of the Outsider, and Dishonored 1's art director, Viktor Antonov, who sadly died just a few days before this video was finished. Both men were astoundingly talented, and it's a real tragedy that we'll never again get to see their unique touch on video game visuals or music. I'd also like to add a massive thank you to my backers on Patreon for keeping the channel going and allowing me to dive into a project as sprawling as this video turned out to be. Sadly, the current state of YouTube makes it pretty hard to keep I Finished a Video Game going with just ad revenue alone. So if you've enjoyed any of my videos, please consider supporting the channel in this way, as it really does make a massive difference. If you do decide to sign up, you get access to early previews of videos, your name in the credits as a thank you, and some pretty meaty exclusives that are made just for Patreon. The last one came out just a few weeks ago and is an hour-long deep dive into Arkane's first ever game, Arx Fatalis. It's essentially a miniature version of a standard I Finished a Video Game retrospective, and if you're remotely interested in 90s style dungeon crawling and esoteric fantasy stories, I'm sure you'll really enjoy it. The next video should be coming out a little faster than this one, and might catch some of you out with the strange direction we're headed in. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.